Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into one of the strangest chapters of history, where showing your ankle could destroy your future, where a woman's entire life could crumble because she tripped getting out of a carriage, and where the Georgian elite lived in absolute terror of feet. Yes, feet. Welcome to the world of Georgian England, where female reputation was more fragile than glass, and the rules protecting it were more absurd than you could ever imagine. So before we dive deep into this peculiar world together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. But only do it if the story truly resonates with you, if it brings you comfort or curiosity. And I am genuinely curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you tucked in bed, maybe with a pet curled up beside you? Are you on a night shift looking for company? Drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and your words truly make my day. Now let me invite you to dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us step back in time together to a world that was both elegant and utterly ridiculous. Picture this. It is 1780 something. You are a young woman in Georgian England and you have just received an invitation to a ball. This is exciting, right? A chance to dance, to laugh, to maybe catch the eye of a suitable gentleman. But before you can even think about enjoying yourself, you need to navigate an invisible minefield of rules. Rules about how you walk, how you sit, what you say, where you look, and most importantly, what parts of your body the world is allowed to see. Now, if you have ever watched a period drama, you have probably heard the old legend, the one that says Georgian and Victorian ladies were so modest, so impossibly pure, that showing an ankle was considered scandalous, shocking, a sign of loose morals. The kind of thing that would have society matrons clutching their pearls and gentlemen averting their eyes in horror. It is a story we've been told over and over, but here is where it gets interesting. It is not entirely true. In fact, it is mostly fiction. Let me take you to a real Georgian ballroom. The year is 1795. The location is Bath, that beautiful spa town where Jane Austen herself would later live and write. The room is lit by hundreds of candles, their warm light flickering across silk gowns and polished floors. An orchestra plays in the corner, and there, on the dance floor, dozens of ladies are spinning, stepping, laughing, with their ankles completely visible. You see, Georgian fashion was actually quite revealing by the standards we imagine. Those empire waist gowns, the ones that sat just below the bust and flowed down in soft, light fabric, they did not drag on the floor like Victorian gowns would later do. The hemlines typically ended right at the ankle, sometimes even a bit above, and when women danced, when they walked quickly, when they climbed stairs or stepped over a puddle, well, ankles were everywhere, silk-stockinged, slipper-clad ankles, and nobody fainted. There are fashion plates from the period, these illustrated guides showing the latest styles, and they clearly depict women's ankles. There are caricatures, satirical prints sold on London street corners, showing ladies with visible lower legs. In 1828, there was even a humorous print titled "Since I Saw You Last, There Is a Change," which made fun of the fact that hemlines had risen to show ankles, with the caption reading, "If fashion's various laws you would obey, the petticoat abridge, the ankle full display." The artist was joking about fashion, not moral outrage. So where did this myth come from? Why do we think Georgian women hid their ankles like they were state secrets? The answer is fascinating. It is a case of Victorian revisionist history. You see, the Victorians, who came after the Georgians, were far more prudish. They looked back at the Georgian era, at the relatively relaxed morals, the gambling, the affairs, the courtesans who were treated like celebrities, and that they were scandalized. The Georgians had been too wild, too free, too fun. So Victorian writers and moralists rewrote the story. They projected their own anxieties about modesty backward in time, creating a false narrative that women had always been that modest, that controlled. But here is the delicious irony. While ankles were perfectly acceptable in Georgian England, there was one word you absolutely could not say. Legs. You could not say the word legs. It was considered vulgar, inappropriate, shockingly crude. The acceptable term was limbs. A lady had limbs, not legs. Limbs, as if she were a tree. You could show them, apparently, but you certainly could not name them. Now, before you think the Georgians were entirely sensible about the whole ankle situation, let me tell you about the exceptions, because there were always exceptions, always little cracks in the facade of rationality. While fashionable ladies at balls could show their ankles without anyone batting an eye, there were certain contexts where ankle visibility became a problem. If a woman tripped getting out of a carriage and her skirt flew up, exposing not just her ankle but her calf, that could cause whispers. Not because anyone had seen anything shocking, but because the accident itself suggested a lack of grace, a lack of control. And control was everything. Georgian society had this bizarre idea that a true lady possessed an innate natural sense of propriety. It was supposedly in her breeding, her blood. A real lady would never make an awkward movement, never lose her balance, never have an ungraceful moment. So when a woman fell or stumbled or had a wardrobe malfunction, the scandal was not really about what was seen. It was about what the incident revealed about her character. She had failed to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection. Let me tell you about someone who understood this game perfectly. Her name was Kitty Fisher, and she was one of the most famous courtesans of the 1760s. Kitty was not respectable by any stretch. She was kept by wealthy men, she had affairs with aristocrats, and society knew it. But Kitty had style, she had audacity. There is a famous story about her that shows just how topsy-turvy Georgian morality could be. One day, a client gave Kitty a £100 banknote. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to thousands of pounds today. But Kitty was insulted by the amount. So what did she do? She put the banknote between 2 slices of bread and ate it. She ate money. She ate £100 in front of witnesses just to prove a point. The story spread across London like wildfire. Prints were made showing Kitty eating her banknote sandwich. People were simultaneously scandalized and delighted. And here is the thing. Kitty became even more famous, even more sought after. But despite all her fame, despite the fact that everyone knew exactly what she was, Kitty still had to maintain certain appearances. In public, she dressed modestly. She attended the theatre and the opera. She rode in Hyde Park in an elegant carriage. She played the game. Because even for someone whose entire profession was scandal, there were lines you did not cross in public. You could be a courtesan, everyone could know you were a courtesan, but you could not be seen stumbling out of a carriage with your skirts over your head. The appearance of grace mattered more than the reality of virtue. This is what made Georgian fears about female reputation so absurd, so contradictory, so completely fascinating. The actual rules were not about morality, they were about performance. A woman could have ankles visible at a ball where everyone could see, but she could not have an accidental wardrobe malfunction. She could be whispered about, gossiped about, even openly known to have a scandalous private life, but she had to maintain graceful public composure. It was theatre. It was all theatre. And the really funny part? Working-class women did not play by any of these rules. A maid, a farm worker, a shop girl, these women wore shorter skirts out of necessity. They had to move freely, to work, to climb, to bend, to run. Their ankles were visible all the time, sometimes even their calves. And society just accepted it, because the rules were never really about modesty. They were about class. They were about maintaining the illusion that upper-class women were a different species, more delicate, more refined, more controlled than ordinary humans. The Georgian fashion historian Linda Baumgarten, who works at Colonial Williamsburg, studied this extensively. She found that skirt length was always a matter of both fashion and occasion. Formal clothing had longer skirts. Work clothing was almost always shorter. Women doing laundry would push up their sleeves and hike up their petticoats without a second thought. Nobody went to the pillory for showing ankles while working. The rules were situational, flexible, and ultimately about performing a certain kind of identity rather than protecting actual modesty. So the next time you hear someone say that Georgian women could not show their ankles, remember Kitty Fisher eating her banknote. Remember the fashion plates showing stockinged legs. Remember the working women with skirts at their knees. The truth is always more complicated, more human, and usually more hilarious than the myths we tell ourselves. But ankles, as silly as the myths around them may be, were just the beginning of the Georgian female reputation panic. Because while feet were mostly fine, there were other body parts, other actions, other tiny infractions that could destroy a woman's future in an instant. And some of them were so ridiculous, so impossible to avoid, that you genuinely have to wonder how any woman survived Georgian society with her reputation intact. In our next part, we are going to explore one of the most weaponized conditions in Georgian England: fainting. That is right, strategic swooning. The art of falling unconscious at exactly the right moment. It was part medical crisis, part social strategy, and entirely bonkers. So stay with me as we continue this strange journey through Georgian fears. Welcome to what might be the strangest chapter in our Georgian story. A chapter about fainting, about women dropping to the floor like autumn leaves, about smelling salts, fainting couches, and something called the vapours, and about how an entire industry was built around the idea that women were so delicate, so impossibly fragile, that they might lose consciousness at any moment. But here is the secret nobody wants to admit. Most of the time they were faking it. Let me paint you a picture. It is 1805. You're at a dinner party in a grand London townhouse. The conversation turns to politics. Someone mentions the war with France. A gentleman uses a mild profanity. Nothing terrible, maybe he says damn, and suddenly a lady at the table gasps. Her hand flies to her chest. Her eyes flutter. She sways in her chair. And then she faints. Servants rush over. Someone calls for smelling salts. The lady is helped to a fainting couch, a piece of furniture specifically designed for this exact scenario. With no arms, so a woman in a full skirt can recline dramatically. Everyone fusses over her. The offending gentleman apologizes profusely. The dinner conversation shifts to safer topics. And the lady, she is just one. She has controlled the entire room without saying a single word. This was the fainting industrial complex of Georgian England, and it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because in a world where women were not allowed to express anger, where they could not argue, where they could not tell a man to shut up or leave them alone, fainting became a weapon. It was socially acceptable weakness that gave women power. Think about it. If you were a Georgian woman and a man was bothering you, what were your options? You could not tell him off. That would be unladylike. You could not leave the room alone. That would be improper. You could not cause a scene. That would ruin your reputation. But you could faint. You could create such a medical emergency that everyone's attention shifted to you. The conversation stopped, and the offensive person was forced to either leave or completely change their behavior. It was genius. Now I know what you might be thinking. Were women really fainting that much? Was everyone just dropping unconscious all the time? And the answer is, it is complicated. Some women genuinely fainted. Georgian fashion, for all its beauty, was not exactly designed for human comfort. Let me tell you about what women were wearing under those lovely empire waist gowns. First was the shift, a simple linen undergarment. Then the stays, which were the Georgian version of a corset, though not quite as extreme as Victorian corsets would later become. But stays were still tight, still restrictive, still designed to create a specific silhouette regardless of whether you could breathe properly. Then there were the petticoats, sometimes multiple layers. And here's where it gets interesting. Most Georgian women did not wear what we would call underwear. That is right. No drawers, no pantaloons, nothing. Those were considered masculine and therefore scandalous. The only women who wore them were prostitutes who needed them for practical reasons under their split skirts. So imagine this. You're corseted, you're wearing multiple layers of heavy fabric, you've eaten a large dinner because refusing food would be rude, you're in a room lit by dozens of candles, which means it is hot, there is no air conditioning, and you're expected to sit up perfectly straight for hours without complaining. Of course you might faint. Of course you might feel dizzy and lightheaded. The real miracle is that anyone stayed conscious. But then there were the other kind of faints, the strategic ones, the tactical swoons, and historians have found evidence of women openly discussing how to fake a convincing faint. There were ladies' magazines that gave advice on it. The key was commitment. You had to commit to the performance. A little gasp first, then the hand to the forehead, then the slow sway, and finally the graceful collapse. Never a sudden drop. That would look fake. Always a gradual descent. And the beauty of it was that nobody could call you out. If someone suggested you were faking, they would look like a monster. How dare you accuse a delicate lady of lying about a medical condition? So women had this incredible tool that was completely socially acceptable and utterly unimpeachable. Let me tell you about Mrs. Bennet. You know Mrs. Bennet, right? The mother from Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen's character who is constantly complaining about her nerves, who faints or nearly faints at the slightest provocation, who needs to lie down, who calls for her smelling salts. We often laugh at Mrs. Bennet. She seems ridiculous, overly dramatic, childish even, but Jane Austen was not mocking all women. She was mocking women who overused this particular strategy. Mrs. Bennet is satire. She represents what happened when strategic fainting became a lifestyle. Because here is the thing about Mrs. Bennet. She is not actually fragile. She is not actually delicate. When she needs to walk 3 miles to Netherfield to check on Jane, she does it. When she needs to scheme and plot to get her daughters married, she has plenty of energy. Her nerves act up specifically when it is convenient, specifically when she wants attention or wants to control a situation. Austen is saying, look, we all know this is a game, and some women are playing it way too hard, but Austen was also sympathetic in her way, because she understood why women did this. Mrs. Bennet has no power. She cannot inherit property. Her husband makes all the decisions. Her family's entire future depends on her daughters marrying well. So she uses the only tools available to her. Her nerves, her vapours, her fainting spells. They are not signs of weakness, they are signs of desperation. Now, let me introduce you to the vapours. This mysterious condition that Georgian women supposedly suffered from constantly. The vapours were this catch-all diagnosis for any kind of nervous distress, anxiety, or emotional upset. Doctors had no idea what actually caused it. Some thought it was fumes rising from the stomach or womb, hence the name vapours, like vapours. Others thought it was a disorder of the nerves. Everyone agreed it was a female problem. Men did not get the vapours. Men had serious medical conditions, women had vapours, and the treatment? Smelling salts. These little bottles of ammonia-based compounds that you would wave under someone's nose. The sharp smell would jolt you back to consciousness, assuming you had actually fainted. But smelling salts became this whole performance unto themselves. Ladies carried ornate bottles, beautiful little things made of silver or crystal. Having your smelling salts on hand was a sign of preparedness, of acknowledging your own delicate nature. Can you imagine carrying around a little bottle specifically designed for when you might faint? It is like if we all walked around with fainting supplies in our pockets. Actually, you know what? Maybe we are not that different. We carry emergency snacks, we carry phone chargers, we carry hand sanitizer. The Georgians carried smelling salts. Different era, same anxiety about being prepared. But the fainting couch. Oh, the fainting couch deserves its own moment. This piece of furniture became absolutely ubiquitous in Georgian homes. It was basically a chaise lounge, but specifically designed for fainting. No arms on one side so your skirts could spread out. Positioned in drawing rooms, in bedrooms. Always ready. And the existence of fainting couches tells us something important. Georgian society expected women to faint. They built furniture for it. It was not an emergency. It was a regular occurrence that required proper accommodation. There are estate inventories from the period, lists of furniture in wealthy homes, and fainting couches show up constantly. Sometimes multiple fainting couches in one house. One in the drawing room, one in the ladies' bedroom, one in the morning room, always ready for the next bout of vapours. Now, let me share something that might surprise you. While all of this fainting was happening among wealthy women, working-class women barely fainted at all. Maids, farm workers, shop girls, they did not have time for vapours. They had work to do. They wore looser clothing because they needed to move. They did not have the luxury of delicate nerves. And guess what? They survived just fine. This tells us something crucial. The fainting was not medical, it was social. It was a class performance. Wealthy women fainted because fainting was a sign that you did not do physical labour. It proved you were delicate, ornamental, in need of protection. It proved you were a lady. Working women could not afford that kind of performance. They needed their strength. They needed to stay conscious and get things done. But here is where it gets even more interesting. Some medical historians today think that many Georgian women were genuinely unwell, but not from vapours. They think it was malnutrition. Wealthy women ate terrible diets by modern standards. Lots of meat, lots of sugar, almost no vegetables, because vegetables were considered peasant food. They wore restrictive clothing that limited their movement. They stayed indoors most of the time because sun exposure would tan their skin, and tan skin was associated with outdoor labour. So they had vitamin deficiencies, poor circulation, weak muscles. No wonder they felt faint. Imagine living your entire life indoors, corseted, eating a nutritionally deficient diet, and then being told that your resulting health problems are because you are naturally delicate. Not because society is slowly suffocating you with ridiculous expectations, just because women are fragile. That is the reality behind the vapours. There is also evidence that some women were suffering from anxiety and depression, but had no way to talk about it. Mental health was not understood. So when a woman felt overwhelmed, when she felt trapped, when she felt desperate, what happened? She had a bout of vapours, she fainted, and instead of getting real help, she got smelling salts and was told to rest. The system diagnosed the symptom but ignored the cause. I want you to think about that for a moment. How many Georgian women were genuinely struggling, genuinely suffering, but the only acceptable way to express it was through fainting? How many women fainted not as strategy but as the only release valve they had? It makes you wonder, does it not? When we look back at Mrs. Bennet, when we laugh at her nerves and her vapours, should we be laughing or should we be sad? Because behind the comedy, there is tragedy. A woman with no power using the only tool society gave her and being mocked for it. But not all Georgian women played this game. Some refused. They looked at the fainting couches and the smelling salts and said, absolutely not. They hiked through mountains, they rode horses, they travelled alone. They proved that women were not naturally delicate, they were just deliberately constrained. And speaking of constraints, we are about to encounter the most suffocating rule in the entire Georgian playbook. The rule that said women could never, ever be alone. That they needed constant supervision, constant watching, constant chaperoning. Not for their safety, mind you, for their reputation. Because in Georgian England, a woman alone was a woman at risk. Not of danger, but of freedom. And freedom, as we're about to discover, was the most terrifying thing of all. Imagine never being alone. Not for a moment. Not to think, not to breathe, not to simply exist without eyes watching your every move. Imagine that from the moment you wake up until the moment you fall asleep, someone is always there, always observing, always judging, always ready to report on your behaviour. This was the reality for unmarried Georgian women. They lived under what I can only describe as a surveillance state, except the watchers were not government agents. They were mothers, aunts, older sisters, paid companions. They were called chaperones, and their entire purpose was to make sure you never, ever did anything that might damage your reputation, which in practice meant making sure you were never alone with a man. Now you might think this rule existed to protect women from danger, from assault, from unwanted advances, from harm. And sure, that was part of the stated reason, but the real purpose was much more cynical. Chaperones existed to protect property, because in Georgian England, an unmarried woman was essentially a walking investment. Her virginity, her reputation, her marriageability, these were valuable assets. And chaperones were there to guard those assets until they could be properly transferred to a husband through marriage. Let me tell you about Lady Caroline Norton. She was born in 1808, right at the tail end of the Georgian era, and her story shows us exactly what the chaperone system was really about. Caroline was beautiful, witty, and from a good family. She married George Norton when she was 19. It seemed like a good match, but George turned out to be controlling, abusive, and financially irresponsible. Still, Caroline tried to make it work. She became friends with Lord Melbourne, the Home Secretary, who would later become Prime Minister. They had long conversations about politics and literature. George encouraged the friendship. After all, being friends with powerful men could only help his own career, right? But then George changed his mind. In 1836, he suddenly accused Caroline of adultery with Lord Melbourne. He sued Melbourne for seducing his wife. And here is the truly horrifying part. Under Georgian and early Victorian law, Caroline had no legal right to defend herself. She could not testify. She could not hire her own lawyer. She could only sit there while men argued about her body, her behaviour, her reputation. Melbourne won the case. The jury decided there was no evidence of adultery. But Caroline's reputation was destroyed anyway, because the accusation alone was enough. It did not matter that she was innocent. It did not matter that she won. She had been publicly accused of sexual impropriety, and that was a stain that could never be washed away. And the worst part? George then refused to let Caroline see their 3 children. He had full legal custody because he was the husband. Caroline had no rights to her own children. None. She spent years fighting for the right to see them, and her campaign eventually led to the Infant Custody Act of 1839. which gave mothers some rights for the first time. But by then, the damage was done. Caroline's story shows us why chaperones existed. It was not about protecting women. It was about making sure that no man could ever accuse a woman of impropriety, because such an accusation, true or false, could destroy her entire life. The chaperone was a witness, living proof that nothing inappropriate happened, because without a witness, a woman had no defense. So what did it actually look like to live under constant supervision? Well, let me walk you through a typical day for an unmarried Georgian lady of means. You wake up. Your lady's maid is there immediately, helping you dress. You go downstairs for breakfast. Your mother or a female relative is at the table. You want to take a walk? You cannot go alone. You need to bring your mother or a sister or a paid companion. You want to visit a friend? Same rules. You want to go shopping? A chaperone comes with you. Someone invites you to a party. Exciting, right? But you cannot just show up. Your chaperone must accompany you. She sits with you, watches who you talk to, monitors how long you spend in conversation with any particular gentleman. If you want to dance, the chaperone is there, watching from the edge of the ballroom. Heaven forbid you slip away to a terrace or a garden for some fresh air. That would be scandalous. That would be the kind of thing that ruins reputations. Do you know what the truly exhausting part was? It was not even about what you actually did. It was about what people might think you did. Because Georgian reputation was not based on reality. It was based on perception. And a woman seen without a chaperone, even if she was doing nothing wrong, could be perceived as doing something wrong. And perception was everything. There is this wonderful, terrible quote from conduct books of the era. These were essentially instruction manuals for how to be a proper lady. One of them stated that a young woman should never be alone with a gentleman unless he was a close family member or family friend. And even then, the door to the room should remain open, always, because as the book explained, the appearance of impropriety is as damaging as impropriety itself. Read that again. The appearance of impropriety is as damaging as impropriety itself. You did not have to actually do anything wrong, you just had to look like you might have done something wrong, and that was enough to ruin you. Now, I have to tell you about the exceptions because they are hilarious. Married women had much more freedom. A married woman could be alone with men who were not her husband. She could go places without a chaperone. She could have male friends. She could even have affairs, as long as she was discreet about it. And Georgian society often looked the other way, especially if she had already produced an heir. So the rule was not really about protecting women from men. If it were, it would apply to married women too, right? No, the rule was about protecting a specific asset, virginity and marriageability, until it could be properly transferred through marriage. After marriage, well, the asset had been delivered. The woman was no longer her family's responsibility. She belonged to her husband now. He could monitor her or not monitor her as he saw fit. This is why widows had so much freedom. A widow had been married, so she was not a virgin, but she was no longer under a husband's control. She could go where she wanted, see whom she wanted, make her own decisions. Widowhood was often the freest time in a Georgian woman's life, which is deeply sad when you think about it. The only way to gain autonomy was for your husband to die. But let me tell you about what actually happened, because rules are one thing and reality is another. People found ways around the chaperone system. Of course they did. Young couples desperate for privacy got creative. Jane Austen herself wrote about this. In letters to her sister, she joked about young people slipping away to back parlours, stealing kisses while family members conveniently looked the other way or pretended to be absorbed in their needlework. Chaperones were human. They got tired. They got bored. Sometimes they fell asleep in their chairs during long evenings. Sometimes they stepped out of the room for a few minutes. Sometimes they actually liked the young man courting their charge and gave them a bit of space. Not all chaperones were dragons. Many were older female relatives who remembered their own youth and had some sympathy. There were also practical problems with the chaperone system. Not every family could afford to have someone available at all times. Middle-class families, families without a lot of servants or relatives nearby, they had to be more flexible. A young woman might go for a walk with just her sister, or even alone if it was just to the local shops. The strict rules were really only enforceable among the wealthy, who had the resources to maintain constant supervision. And then there was the question of who exactly counted as an appropriate chaperone. Conduct books said it should be a mother or older female relative. But what if your mother was dead? What if you did not have aunts or older sisters? Then you might hire a companion, usually an impoverished gentlewoman who needed work. These women lived in a strange liminal space. They were ladies, so they were respectable enough to be chaperones. But they were poor, so they had to work. They were simultaneously above servants and below the family they served. Being a paid companion could be utterly miserable. You had no real power, but you had all the responsibility. If your charge's reputation was damaged, you would be blamed. You were expected to be always available, always vigilant, always proper. You had no private life of your own, and you were often treated as less than, neither truly family nor truly servant, just this uncomfortable in-between. Think about how isolating this must have been for everyone involved. The young woman, never alone, never free, always watched. The chaperone, stuck in a job that required constant attention and offered no thanks. Even the men were trapped in this system. If a gentleman wanted to get to know a lady, really know her, have genuine conversations, he had to do it with a third person always present. How do you fall in love under surveillance? Some couples managed it. They developed their own codes, their own ways of communicating under the chaperone's watchful eye. A certain tone of voice, a particular way of handing over a book, a specific seat chosen in a drawing room, small rebellions, tiny moments of privacy, carved out of constant observation, but others just went through the motions. They had the chaperoned courtship that society required. They got engaged, they got married, and they barely knew each other. How many Georgian marriages were between essentially strangers? Two people who had only ever spoken in the presence of others, who had never had a real, private, honest conversation. And here is something I find particularly heartbreaking. Letters. Young couples would write letters to each other, hoping for some privacy, some intimacy through written words. But even that was monitored. Parents would often read their daughters' letters before allowing them to be sent. Some mothers even insisted on being present when letters arrived, reading them aloud to make sure nothing inappropriate was written. Imagine pouring your heart out in a letter, knowing your mother was going to read every word. Imagine receiving a letter and having to listen to your mother recite it instead of reading it yourself. The chaperone system extended even to paper and ink. There was no escape. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone fight back? Did anyone refuse? And the answer is yes. Some women did, but they paid a heavy price. There were women who insisted on going places alone. Who refused chaperones? Who said, "I am an adult human being and I can manage my own affairs"? And society looked at these women and called them fast. That was the term, fast. It meant loose, improper, not quite respectable. A fast woman was suspected of having low morals, and being labelled fast could make you unmarriageable. But here is what I love. Some women decided they did not care. They decided that being unmarriageable was better than being trapped. They chose freedom over reputation. They travelled. They had adventures. They lived. And yes, they were gossiped about. Yes, they were excluded from certain social circles, but they were alive in a way that their chaperoned peers were not. The chaperone system could not last. It was unsustainable. It required too many resources, too much constant vigilance. As the 19th century progressed, as society began to change, the rules started to relax. But in the Georgian era, if you were an unmarried woman of the upper classes, you lived in a gilded cage. Beautiful, perhaps, comfortable, certainly, but a cage nonetheless. And if the chaperone system was exhausting, wait until you hear about what came next. Because Georgians did not just monitor who you spent time with, they controlled who you could even meet in the first place. The introduction system was so complex, so full of rules and hierarchies, that navigating it required the strategic mind of a military general. One wrong move, one improper introduction, and you could offend someone so badly that your entire social world collapsed. So take a breath, because we are about to enter the battlefield of Georgian social introductions. You know that awkward moment at a party when you see someone you vaguely know, and you're not sure if you should say hello or pretend you have not seen them. That split-second calculation of social risk? Now multiply that anxiety by about 1,000, add in the possibility that making the wrong choice could permanently exile you from polite society, and you have just entered the Georgian introduction system. This was not just etiquette, this was social warfare, and the weapons were names, titles, and the power to grant or withhold recognition. Is how it worked. You could not simply walk up to someone and introduce yourself. That would be vulgar, presumptuous, absolutely unthinkable. You needed a mutual acquaintance to perform the introduction, but not just any mutual acquaintance. They needed to be of appropriate social standing. They needed to have permission from both parties. And they needed to know the exact hierarchy involved, because you always introduced the lower-ranking person to the higher-ranking person, never the other way around. Confused yet? It gets worse. Let me give you an example. Imagine you are at a ball. You see a woman across the room, and your friend knows her. You would like to meet her. Simple enough, right? Wrong. First, your friend must approach the woman privately and ask, "May I present Miss Smith to you?" The woman can say yes, or she can say no. If she says no, that is it. Game over. Your friend returns and makes some polite excuse about how the lady is feeling unwell or must leave shortly. You never get to meet her. You do not even get to know that she refused. But let us say she agrees. Your friend then brings you over and performs the introduction. "Miss Jones, may I present Miss Smith?" You both give a slight bow, a small acknowledgement. And now you are acquainted. You can speak to each other at future events. You can acknowledge each other on the street. You've entered each other's social circle. Except here is the catch. If you ever see Miss Jones again in public and do not acknowledge her, you have just cut her. And cutting someone was the social equivalent of nuclear warfare. The cut. Let me tell you about the cut, because this might be the most vicious social rule in the entire Georgian playbook. Once you had been introduced to someone, you were obligated to acknowledge them whenever you met. A slight nod, a small bow, a brief greeting. Nothing elaborate, but something. Failing to do this, failing to recognize an acquaintance, was called cutting them, and it was a public announcement that you considered them beneath you, that you no longer wished to associate with them, that they were socially dead to you. The thing is, you could not just cut anyone for any reason. Conduct manuals warned that a lady should never cut someone unless it was absolutely necessary. You needed a serious justification. Had they committed some terrible social offence? Had they been involved in a scandal? Had they behaved dishonourably? If not, cutting them made you look cruel, petty, vindictive. It could damage your reputation as much as theirs. But here is where it gets deliciously complicated. Women had more freedom to cut people than men did. A gentleman was expected to acknowledge everyone he'd been introduced to always, no matter what. But a lady could choose not to see someone. She could look right past them as if they were invisible. And if she did it, everyone understood she had a reason. They might not know what the reason was, but they trusted that it was serious. This gave women a tiny sliver of power. If a man was bothering you, if he had made improper advances, if he had insulted you, you could cut him. You could not confront him directly, you could not tell him off, but you could erase him from your social world. And because men depended on being acknowledged by the respectable women to maintain their own social standing, this could actually hurt them. There was also something called the cut direct, which was even more brutal. The regular cut was passive, you just did not see the person. But the cut direct was active. You looked right at them, made eye contact, and then deliberately turned away. It was unmistakable. It was intentional. It was a public humiliation. And it was rare, because it was so extreme. You only used the cut direct if someone had done something truly unforgivable. Now, think about what this system created. It created a world where every social interaction was a minefield. You had to remember everyone you had ever been introduced to. You had to acknowledge them appropriately. You had to calibrate your greeting to their rank. A slight bow for an equal, a deeper bow for someone above you, a barely perceptible nod for someone below you. Get it wrong and you had either insulted someone in by not showing enough respect or humiliated yourself by showing too much. And the introduction system was specifically designed to protect women's reputations, because you could not be introduced to someone scandalous. No respectable person would introduce you. So if you were only speaking to people you'd been properly introduced to, theoretically, you were only associating with appropriate people. The introduction was a vetting process, a background check performed by your social network. But this meant that your social circle was entirely controlled by other people. You could only meet people that your existing acquaintances approved of. You could not expand your network independently. You could not make your own choices about who was interesting or worth knowing. Everything was mediated, controlled, monitored. Let me tell you about Pride and Prejudice again, because Jane Austen understood this system better than anyone. Remember the scene at the Meryton Assembly, the first ball? Mr. Darcy refuses to be introduced to anyone. He dances only with the ladies in his own party, the ones he came with. He stands around looking bored and superior, and when his friend Bingley suggests he dance with Elizabeth, Darcy says she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt him. Now, we read that and think Darcy is just being a snob. And he is, but he's also following a specific social rule. Darcy cannot simply ask Elizabeth to dance. He has not been introduced to her. He would need someone to perform the introduction first. And Darcy, being proud and antisocial, does not want to go through that process. He does not want to meet new people. He wants to be left alone. But here's what makes it worse. By refusing introductions, Darcy is insulting the entire community. He is saying, none of you are worth knowing. None of you are important enough for me to bother learning your names. It is a massive social slight. And everyone at the ball knows it. They are offended, and rightfully so. Later in the book, when Darcy wants to fix his mistake, when he wants to get to know Elizabeth properly, he has to wait for an appropriate opportunity. He has to wait until they are at a dinner party together, in the home of mutual acquaintances, where someone can perform a proper introduction or reintroduction. He cannot just approach her on the street and start talking. That would be wildly inappropriate. This is why Elizabeth's friendship with Wickham is so scandalous in retrospect. Wickham essentially introduces himself. He approaches Elizabeth and her aunt while they are shopping in town, and he just starts talking to them. Now, he has some excuse. He knows someone they know, but it is still pushing the boundaries. And Elizabeth, being young and naive, does not realize how irregular this is. She thinks Wickham is charming and open. She does not see that he is actually being improper. Later, when she discovers that Wickham is a liar and a fortune hunter, she realizes that his willingness to break social rules was a red flag. Proper gentlemen did not introduce themselves. They waited for formal introductions. Wickham's charm was actually a warning sign that he could not be trusted to follow any rules, social or otherwise. Now, let me tell you about the man of the house. Because in Georgian families, introductions were specifically the responsibility of the male head of household. Your father, your older brother, your uncle, whoever was in charge. He decided who got introduced to the women in his family. He controlled access. This meant that if you were a young woman living with your father, you could only meet people your father approved of. He decided which gentlemen were suitable acquaintances. He decided which families were worth knowing. You had no say. Even if you met someone interesting at a party, even if you wanted to know them better, if your father refused to perform the introduction, you were stuck. Can you imagine that? Imagine seeing someone who shares your interests, who you think you could be friends with, and being told no, you cannot meet them because your father has decided they are not appropriate. Your entire social world was curated by someone else. And it was not even always about protecting you. Sometimes it was about your father's own social ambitions. He would introduce you to people who could benefit him, who had connections he wanted, who belonged to circles he wanted to enter. You were a tool for his networking. Your relationship served his purposes. But here is where the system gets truly Byzantine. There were different rules for different ranks. If you were introducing two people of equal social standing, either could technically be introduced first. But if one person was of higher rank, you always introduced the lower person to the higher person. You would say, "Your Grace, may I present Miss Smith?" Never Miss Smith. "May I present the Duke of wherever?" And you had to know everyone's exact rank. Was someone a duke, a marquis, an earl, a viscount, a baron? Was someone the daughter of a peer, or merely the wife of a gentleman? The forms of address were different for each. Call a duke my lord instead of your grace, and you had made a humiliating mistake. Introduce people in the wrong order, and you had insulted someone. There were entire books published about this. Guides to forms of address. How to properly introduce people of various ranks, what to say, what not to say, how to bow, when to bow. It was so complicated that even people who grew up in this world sometimes got it wrong. And making a mistake could have consequences. People held grudges. They remembered slights, real or perceived. Let me tell you about Lady Catherine de Bourgh, another character from Pride and Prejudice. When Elizabeth visits Lady Catherine's estate, Lady Catherine is rude to her. She asks intrusive questions. She makes condescending comments. She treats Elizabeth like a servant. And we are supposed to see Lady Catherine as the villain. But here is the thing. By the rules of Georgian society, Lady Catherine is actually being generous. She has allowed Elizabeth to visit. She has acknowledged her. She could have refused to meet Elizabeth at all. As a lady of high rank, she had every right to refuse an introduction to someone she considered beneath her. The fact that she is even speaking to Elizabeth is, in Lady Catherine's view, a kindness. She is being rude, yes, but she is doing so while technically following the rules. This is what the introduction system created. A world where basic human interaction was a privilege granted by the powerful, where simply meeting someone required permission, approval, mediation, where you could live your entire life inside a bubble of pre-approved acquaintances, never meeting anyone your social circle had not vetted first. And here is the cruelest part. This system trapped everyone, but it trapped women most of all, because men, even men of lower rank, had more freedom. They could go to coffee houses, to clubs, to business establishments. They could meet people through work, through politics, through public life. But women, especially unmarried women, they had no such opportunities. Their entire social world was the drawing room, the ballroom, the church, and every person in those spaces had to be properly introduced. This is why Georgian novels are so obsessed with balls and parties, because that was where people met. That was the only place where introductions could happen, where social circles could expand. Miss out on the ball season and you might miss your only chance to meet a potential husband. Stay home for a season and your social circle would shrink. Your opportunities would vanish. The introduction system was not designed to help women. It was designed to control them, to limit their choices, to keep them dependent, to make sure they only associated with people their families approved of. It was a cage built out of politeness, but some people found ways around it. Clever people, rebellious people, people who decided the rules were stupid and ignored them. There were accidental meetings that were not really accidents. There were chance encounters that had been carefully planned. There were letters passed through servants, messages delivered by helpful friends. Where there is a will, there is a way. And Georgian young people had a lot of will. Still, the anxiety must have been exhausting. Always wondering if you were following the rules correctly. Always afraid of making a mistake. Always aware that one wrong word, one improper acknowledgement could mark you as either a social climber or a social disaster. Do you ever feel that way? Like you're constantly performing, constantly monitoring yourself, constantly worried about saying or doing the wrong thing? Maybe we are not so different from the Georgians after all. We still care deeply about social approval. We still have complex rules about who can contact whom, who should make the first move, what is appropriate and what is not. We have just moved the battlefield from ballrooms to group chats and social media. But at least we can introduce ourselves. At least we have that much freedom. The Georgians did not even have that. And if you think the introduction system was stressful, just wait. Because we are about to enter an even more treacherous territory. The ballroom, where a single dance could mean everything, where accepting the wrong partner could ruin your reputation, and where the rules were so complex that one misstep could lead to social catastrophe. So settle in, because the music is about to start. And in Georgian England, dancing was never just dancing. There is something magical about a ballroom, is there not? The swirl of silk gowns, the glitter of candlelight, the swell of music filling a grand space. It seems romantic, elegant, like something out of a fairy tale. But in Georgian England, the ballroom was not a fairy tale. It was a chess match. A high-stakes game where every move mattered, where one wrong step could cost you everything, and where young women carried tiny cards in their gloves to keep track of which men they'd promised their dances to, because forgetting could be catastrophic. Let me tell you about the dance card. It was a small booklet, sometimes no bigger than your palm, often beautifully decorated with painted flowers or gilt edges. Inside were blank lines, one for each dance of the evening, and these little cards were not just pretty accessories. They were legal documents, social contracts, proof of your intentions. When a gentleman asked you to dance, you would write his name on your card next to a specific dance. The first dance, the fifth dance, the supper dance. And that was a binding commitment. You could not change your mind. You could not give that dance to someone else. You had agreed, and in the world of Georgian etiquette, your word was everything. Now here is where it gets interesting. Dancing with a man was not just dancing, it was a statement. It was a public announcement that you were willing to consider his romantic interest. Because balls were not really about dancing, they were about courtship. They were the only socially acceptable place where young men and women could interact, could touch hands, could be close to each other. So every dance meant something. Dance with a man once? That was polite. That was normal. Dance with him twice in one evening? Now you were getting into dangerous territory. People would notice, people would talk. They would assume there was a special attachment, a romantic understanding. Dance with the same man 3 times? You might as well be engaged. Because 3 dances meant serious interest, and serious interest meant everyone expected a proposal to follow. Can you imagine the pressure? You are at a ball. You're 18, maybe 19 years old. A gentleman asks you to dance. He seems nice enough. You say yes. You write his name on your card, but then, as the evening goes on, you realize you do not like him very much. Maybe he is oaring, maybe he steps on your feet, maybe he makes inappropriate comments, but he asks for a second dance. And here is your dilemma. If you say no, you need a good reason. You cannot simply say you do not want to. That would be rude. The only acceptable excuse is that you are feeling unwell. But here is the trap. If you claim illness and refuse his second dance, you cannot dance with anyone else for the rest of the evening. Because if you do, everyone will know you lied. You will have publicly insulted him. You will have marked yourself as dishonest and cruel. Your reputation will suffer. So your choices are: dance with him again and risk people thinking you are interested, or refuse and sit out the rest of the ball. Those are your only options. There is no middle ground, no polite way to say no thank you. I would rather dance with someone else. This is why strategic card management became essential. Smart women would leave gaps on their cards. They would tell gentlemen that certain dances were already claimed, even if they were not. That way, if they wanted to avoid a second dance with someone, they had an escape route. They could say, "Oh, I am so sorry, but I have already promised the next dance to Mr. So-and-so." It was a lie, but it was a socially acceptable lie. And mothers taught their daughters this. How to manage your card, how to leave yourself options, how to politely evade without causing offence. It was a whole skill set, this dance card diplomacy. But let me tell you what happened if you mismanaged your card. There are accounts, actual historical accounts, of women whose reputations were damaged because they danced too many times with one man, not because anything improper happened, just because of the dancing itself. Because by dance 3, everyone assumed an engagement was imminent. And if no engagement followed, people wondered why. What went wrong? Did he change his mind? Did her family reject him? Did something scandalous happen that we do not know about? The woman would be marked as damaged goods. She'd been publicly courted and then rejected, or she'd led a man on and then changed her mind. Either way, her value on the marriage market decreased. Other men would be wary. They would wonder what the problem was. And in a world where reputation was everything, even the hint of a problem could be disastrous. Now let me tell you about the supper dance. This was the dance right before supper was served at a ball. And it was special because whoever you danced the supper dance with, you would then eat supper with. You would sit at a table together. You would share food. You would have extended conversation. It was the longest, most intimate interaction you could have at a ball, aside from actual courtship. So the supper dance was the most sought-after dance of the evening. Gentlemen planned their strategy around it. Which lady do I want to spend supper with? Who is most likely to say yes? If I ask too early, will someone else ask her first? If I wait too long, will her card be full? And women knew this too. The supper dance was the one you saved for someone special. You did not waste it on just anyone. If a man you were not interested in asked for the supper dance, you absolutely filled that slot on your card with a fake name if you had to. Because sitting through supper with someone you could not stand, being trapped at a table with them for an hour, that was social torture. There is a wonderful scene in a lesser-known novel from the period where a young woman accepts the supper dance from a man she barely knows, just to be polite. And then she spends the entire supper regretting it because he talks endlessly about his dogs, his hunting dogs, for an hour. She cannot leave. She cannot change seats. She can only sit there and smile and nod while he describes his hounds in excruciating detail. And the author uses this to show how trapped women were by these politeness rules. You could not just walk away. You had to endure. Now let me tell you about the other side of this equation. What if nobody asked you to dance? What if your card stayed empty? This was every Georgian girl's nightmare. Standing at the edge of the ballroom watching everyone else dance, your card blank, your evening ruined. And it was not just disappointing, it was humiliating. It was public proof that nobody wanted you, that you were not desirable, not interesting, not worth pursuing. Mothers would sometimes intervene. They would approach young men they knew and suggest, "Oh, my daughter has not danced yet. Perhaps you might ask her." This was mortifying for the daughter, but mothers did it anyway because an empty card was worse. At least if you danced, even if everyone knew your mother had arranged it, you could maintain the fiction of being marriageable. Some women brought books to balls. They would sit in corners reading, pretending they chose not to dance, that they were above such frivolities. But everyone knew the truth. The book was armour, protection against the shame of being ignored. And then there were the men who used this system cruelly. Men who would ask a woman to dance and then not show up for that dance. They would leave her waiting on the ballroom floor, looking around, increasingly anxious as the music started, and her partner was nowhere to be found. Sometimes these men did it deliberately, as a power move, a way to humiliate someone they considered beneath them. Other times they genuinely forgot. But either way, the woman was left standing there, abandoned, while everyone watched. What could she do? She could not make a scene. She could not demand to know where he was. She could only return to her seat, try to look calm, try to pretend it did not matter. But everyone knew, everyone had seen, and they would gossip about it for weeks. Do you remember Mr. Darcy at the Meryton Assembly? He refuses to dance with anyone except the ladies in his own party. He insults Elizabeth by saying she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt him. And this refusal to dance, this public rejection of an entire community, this was a massive social insult, because the whole point of attending a ball was to dance. If you did not want to dance, you stayed home. By attending but refusing to participate, Darcy was saying, "I am here, but none of you are worthy of my attention. I am too important, too elevated to bother with you." It was arrogant, it was rude, and it was exactly the kind of behaviour that ruined social events. But here is what makes Darcy's behaviour even worse. He is a gentleman. He has money, status, connections. Women would have been thrilled to dance with him. He could have made someone's entire evening just by asking. He could have been kind. Instead, he chose to be cruel. And the community remembered. They judged him for it. His reputation suffered, even though he was rich and powerful, because he had failed the basic test of social decency. Later in the novel, when Darcy tries to fix things, when he wants Elizabeth to see him differently, he has to work incredibly hard, amazing. Because first impressions mattered in Georgian society. That initial judgment, formed at the first ball, the first meeting, it stuck. People did not easily change their minds. Now let me tell you about the actual dancing itself, because the dances were not like modern dancing. They were structured, formal, with specific steps and patterns. The most common dances were country dances, where couples formed long lines and moved through choreographed sequences. You would dance with your partner, then separate, dance with someone else, then return. It was social, communal, carefully organised. And this created opportunities. Brief moments when you and your partner were together, could whisper quickly, could exchange a few words before the dance separated you again. These moments were precious. They were your only chance for semi-private conversation in a completely public space. Smart couples used them well. A quick compliment, a meaningful look, a softly spoken question, and then, apart again, back to the choreography, back to performance. But you had to be careful, because everyone was watching. Chaperones lined the edges of the ballroom observing. Other dancers were close by. If you held your partner's hand too long, if you stood too close during the figures, if you looked too intently into each other's eyes, people noticed, and they talked. There were also waltzes, though these were controversial. The waltz involved holding your partner close, your bodies almost touching his hand on your waist. It was intimate, scandalous even. Some people considered it improper. Young ladies were discouraged from waltzing, especially with men they were not engaged to. The closeness was too much, too suggestive. But of course, that made waltzing incredibly appealing. It was forbidden, therefore exciting. Couples who wanted to push boundaries would waltz, and society would tut and whisper and judge, but they would also keep watching, fascinated despite their disapproval. Let me tell you about something historians found. They discovered actual dance cards from the 1780s and 1790s, these tiny surviving artifacts, and on some of them, women had written little notes next to the men's names. Small annotations. One card had next to a gentleman's name the word tiresome in tiny letters. Another had stepped on my foot twice. These little rebellions, these private judgments, they show us that Georgian women were not passive. They were observing, evaluating, forming their own opinions, even while playing by society's rules. And here is something that might surprise you. Working-class balls had completely different rules. When servants had their own dances, when shop workers and labourers got together for an evening, they danced however they wanted. Cards were optional or non-existent. You could dance with the same person all night if you wanted. You could refuse a dance without elaborate excuses. The rigid rules were for the upper classes only. Everyone else just danced. This tells us, once again, that the rules were not really about propriety. They were about control, about maintaining class boundaries, about ensuring that upper-class women performed their roles correctly, that they did not make independent choices, that they followed the script society had written for them. But some women refused the script. They broke the rules deliberately. They danced more than twice with men they liked. They accepted third dances and faced the gossip. They managed their cards the way they wanted, not the way their mothers told them to. And yes, they faced consequences. But they also had more fun. They had more freedom. They lived more authentically, even within a system designed to prevent authenticity. The ballroom was supposed to be magical, and in some ways it was. The music, the movement, the rare opportunity to touch another person's hand in a world where touch was forbidden. But it was also exhausting, the constant vigilance, the fear of making mistakes, the knowledge that every moment was being judged. Do you ever feel like that at social events? Like you are performing rather than participating? Like you are managing other people's perceptions instead of just being yourself? That feeling did not start with social media. It has been with us for centuries. The Georgians just wore better dresses while doing it. And speaking of managing perceptions, we are about to encounter something even more treacherous than dance cards. We're about to talk about letters, because in Georgian England, the wrong letter could destroy your life. Love letters were not just romantic, they were evidence. They were legal documents that could be used in court. They were proof of promises made, of intentions declared, and if those letters fell into the wrong hands, if an engagement ended badly, those letters could be weaponized. So take a breath, because we are entering the dangerous world of Georgian correspondence, where every word mattered and nothing was ever truly private. Think about the last text message you sent to someone you care about. Now imagine that message could be used against you in court, that someone could read it aloud to a jury, that it could be printed in newspapers for everyone to see, that it could cost you thousands of pounds, your reputation, your entire future. Would you have written it differently? Would you have sent it at all? In Georgian England, every letter was potentially that dangerous. Let me tell you a stay. It is 1784, and a young man named William Beckford has just written a series of letters to another young man, William Courtenay. They are passionate letters, affectionate letters, the kind of letters you write when you are young and feel deeply about someone. Beckford is 24 years old, he is a member of Parliament. He is wealthy, cultured, one of the richest men in England. He has everything to lose, and then the letters are discovered. They are intercepted by William Courtenay's uncle Lord Loughborough, who is horrified by what he reads. He sees evidence of what the Georgians called an unnatural attachment, a same-sex relationship, and in Georgian England, this is not just scandalous, it is illegal, it is punishable by death. Lord Loughborough does not go to the police, he does something worse. He goes public, he shows the letters to other people, he lets them circulate among high society, he makes sure everyone knows what Beckford wrote, what he felt, what he did. And William Beckford's life collapses overnight. He is ostracised. Doors that were always open to him are suddenly closed. Invitations stop coming, friends turn away. He cannot go to parties, cannot show his face in society, cannot even walk down the street without people pointing and whispering. His political career is over. His social life is over. Everything is over. And all because of letters, words on paper that he thought were private. Beckford eventually leaves England with his wife. He spends years in Europe, essentially in exile. He does return eventually. He lives a long life, but he never fully recovers his reputation. Those letters followed him forever. They defined him. They destroyed the life he had built and replaced it with scandal. Now, you might think this is an extreme case. Same-sex relationships were uniquely dangerous in Georgian England, and that is true. But here is the thing. All letters were dangerous. Even perfectly respectable love letters between a man and a woman who were courting could become weapons if the relationship ended badly. Let me explain how. In Georgian England, a man and woman exchanged letters in which they expressed affection, made plans for the future, discussed marriage. Those letters were legal evidence of a promise. If the man then broke off the engagement, the woman could sue him for breach of promise, and those letters would be read in court. Every romantic word, every private feeling, every intimate thought, all of it made public. The woman could win substantial damages, enough money to support herself for years, but she would also be publicly humiliated. Because the letters would be printed in newspapers. Everyone would read them. Everyone would know exactly what she wrote, how she felt, what she offered. Her private feelings would become public entertainment. And if the woman broke off the engagement, the man could use the letters against her too. He could show them to people, prove that she had led him on, damage her reputation so badly that no other man would want her. The letters were insurance policies, blackmail material, weapons waiting to be deployed. This is why conduct books gave very specific advice about letter writing. Never put anything in a letter that you would not want read aloud in public. Never express feelings too strongly. Never make explicit promises. Be affectionate but vague. Be warm but careful, because you never knew where that letter might end up. And when an engagement ended, there was a ritual. The couple had to return each other's letters. All of them. This was non-negotiable. The letters had to be given back, sometimes in the presence of witnesses, and then, usually, they were burned. Both parties would burn their returned letters, destroying the evidence, eliminating the danger. Except sometimes they were not burned. Sometimes one person kept copies. Sometimes they kept the originals despite promising to burn them. And then, if things turned ugly, out came the letters. Proof, ammunition, destruction. There is a fascinating account from the historian Sally Holloway, who studied Georgian courtship extensively. She found records of couples who, after breaking up, would very formally return each other's letters, sometimes through intermediaries. The letters would be wrapped in packages, sealed, delivered, and the recipient would have to acknowledge receipt, confirm that everything was returned. It was like a legal transaction, this exchange of paper, because both parties understood the risk. Holloway also found accounts of women who begged for their letters back, who were terrified of what might happen if their words were made public, and men who refused to return letters, who held on to them deliberately, using them as leverage or as revenge. Can you imagine pouring your heart out to someone, trusting them with your deepest feelings, and then having to worry that those feelings might be used to destroy you? That every word you wrote in love could later be read in malice? But here is where it gets even more complicated. Letters were not actually private in the way we think of privacy. Families would often read each other's letters. Fathers would read their daughters' correspondence before allowing it to be sent. Mothers would read incoming letters aloud to the whole family. Servants would deliver letters, but might also gossip about who was writing to whom. There is a wonderful detail in some Georgian correspondence where people would write in code, or use initials instead of names, or develop private languages with their correspondence. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because they wanted some tiny bit of privacy, some protection from constant surveillance. Jane Austen wrote about this beautifully. In her letters to her sister Cassandra, she sometimes mentions burning parts of letters or tearing out pages because they contained things too private to risk anyone else seeing. And these were letters between sisters, people who trusted each other completely. But Jane still knew that letters could fall into wrong hands, that servants might read them, that family members might find them. Nothing was truly safe. Let me tell you about another kind of letter danger. Anonymous letters. These were letters sent without a signature, usually containing accusations or gossip, and they were surprisingly common in Georgian England. People would write anonymous letters to warn others about scandals, to spread rumours, to accuse people of impropriety. And because they were anonymous, the sender faced no consequences. Some of these letters were sent out of genuine concern. Someone might anonymously warn a family that their daughter was being courted by a fortune hunter, or that a young man they trusted was actually a gambler. But many were sent out of malice, jealousy, spite. People used anonymous letters to destroy reputations, to settle scores, to cause chaos. And here is the worst part. You could not defend yourself against an anonymous accusation. You did not know who wrote it. You did not know what evidence they had. You could only watch as the rumours spread, as people whispered, as your reputation crumbled. All because of a letter written by someone who would not even sign their name. There were also intercepted letters. In an era when post was delivered by riders and coaches, when letters passed through many hands, it was relatively easy to intercept correspondence. A servant could be bribed. A postal worker could be paid to let someone read a letter before delivering it. Families spied on each other this way. Employers spied on servants. Suspicious spouses spied on each other. The lack of privacy was absolute, and everyone knew it. So people developed strategies. They would send letters through trusted friends instead of through the post. They would hand-deliver notes. They would meet in person to discuss anything truly sensitive. But these solutions created their own problems, because meeting in person without a chaperone was also scandalous. Let me tell you about love tokens. Because letters were so dangerous, couples would exchange other items instead. Small gifts, tokens, mementos, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, a pressed flower, a piece of jewellery. These items could not be read, could not be used as evidence, could not be twisted into something they were not. They were safer than words. But even these tokens had to be returned if an engagement ended. Everything had to be given back. The letters, the gifts, the tokens. It was a complete erasure, a dismantling of the relationship, and it had to be done publicly enough that both families could confirm everything was returned, but privately enough that it did not become even more of a scandal. Sally Holloway describes this as returning the material debris of a relationship. And I love that phrase, material debris, as if love was a shipwreck and these objects were the wreckage washing ashore. You gathered it all up, gave it back, and tried to move on as if nothing had happened. But how do you pretend nothing happened when your private feelings have been exposed? When letters you thought were sacred have been passed around like newspapers, when words you wrote in trust have been read by strangers? Some women never recovered. They were so traumatized by having their letters made public that they never wrote intimate letters again. They never fully trusted anyone again. They built walls around their feelings and never let them out onto paper. And some women became strategic. They wrote letters that were affectionate but carefully worded. Letters that expressed warmth but made no specific promises. Letters that could be read in court without causing damage. They learned to write defensively, always aware of the potential audience. Think about what this did to relationships. How can you be truly intimate with someone if every word you write might be weaponized? How can you be honest about your feelings if honesty is dangerous? How can you build trust when privacy does not exist? The answer is, you could not. Not really. Georgian courtships were performances, carefully staged, constantly monitored. Real intimacy was nearly impossible, and everyone knew it. They accepted it as the price of respectability, but there were rebels. There were people who wrote honestly anyway, who took the risk, who decided that a life without authentic connection was not worth living. They wrote passionate letters, love letters, honest letters, and some of them got lucky. They married, they burned their letters together after the wedding, and no one ever saw them, but others were not lucky. Their letters were discovered, or their relationships ended badly, and then everyone saw everything, and they paid the price for their honesty. I want you to think about something. We often romanticize the Georgian era. We watch the period dramas, we see the beautiful dresses and the elegant balls, and we think how lovely it must have been. But imagine living in a world where you could not even write honestly to someone you loved, where every word had to be calculated, every feeling had to be censored, where privacy was a luxury you could not afford and trust was a risk you could not take. Would you want to live there? Would you trade the freedom to speak and write honestly for empire waistgowns and candlelit ballrooms? I know I would not. The letter system was meant to facilitate courtship, to allow young couples to get to know each other. But in practice it created fear. It made people guarded, defensive, paranoid. It turned correspondence into a minefield where one wrong word could detonate your entire future. And the saddest part is that many Georgian couples got married without ever really knowing each other. They had conducted an entire courtship through carefully worded letters, chaperoned conversations, and supervised dances. They had never been alone. They had never spoken freely. They married strangers and hoped for the best. Some got lucky. They discovered they actually liked each other. But others found themselves trapped in marriages to people they did not know, did not understand, could not connect with. And in Georgian England there was no escape. Divorce was nearly impossible. You were stuck. So the letter rules, like all the other reputation rules, they were not designed to help people. They were designed to control them, to limit their choices, to monitor their feelings, to make sure nobody stepped out of line. The letters were just another form of surveillance, another way to ensure that everyone played their assigned roles. But letters were not the only way reputations could be damaged. There was something even more precarious, even more carefully regulated, even more absurd, and that was the simple act of getting out of a carriage. Yes, you heard that right. Exiting a vehicle. Because in Georgian England, even gravity was a threat to female reputation, and one awkward stumble could mean social death. Picture yourself stepping out of a car. You open the door, you swing your legs out, you stand up. Maybe you stumble a little if you're tired. Maybe you catch yourself on the doorframe. Maybe your coat gets caught and you have to tug it free. It is such an ordinary moment. something you do without thinking, something nobody notices or cares about. Now imagine that same moment could ruin your life. This was the reality for Georgian women trying to exit carriages. Because Georgian carriages were not designed for the human body, they were tall, requiring you to step down from a significant height. They had narrow doors that your wide skirts barely fit through. They bounced and swayed on terrible roads, making balance precarious. And you were expected to exit them with perfect grace, perfect modesty, perfect control. One slip, one awkward moment, one gust of wind catching your skirt, and you had just committed what the Georgians called an immodest fall. An immodest fall. Let that phrase sink in. The fall itself was not the problem. The immodesty was. What they meant was that during the fall, during the stumble, during the loss of balance, someone might see something they should not see. Your legs above the ankle, your petticoats, heaven forbid your actual skin. And that exposure, even if it was completely accidental, even if you had no control over it, could damage your reputation irreparably. Conduct books from the era warned young women specifically about this danger. One manual stated that a lady must take the utmost care when entering or exiting a vehicle, as an immodest display, however unintentional, reflects poorly on her breeding and suggests a lack of proper refinement. Not an accident, not bad luck, a reflection of your breeding, a suggestion that you were not really a lady at all. Can you imagine living with that pressure? Every time you had to get out of a carriage, which might be multiple times a day if you were visiting, shopping, attending events, you had to execute a complex maneuver while wearing restrictive clothing and knowing that one mistake could have social consequences. Let me walk you through what this actually looked like. You're in a carriage, sitting on a bench seat that is probably not very comfortable. The carriage stops. The footman opens the door and flips down the step, but that step is small, narrow, and probably muddy. You have to gather your skirts in one hand, hold onto the door frame with the other, place your foot carefully on that tiny step, shift your weight without losing balance, and then step down to the ground, all while maintaining an erect posture, a serene expression, and making it look effortless. If you were wealthy enough, you had a footman to assist you. He would offer his hand, and you could use him for balance, but you could not lean on him too heavily. That would suggest you were weak, ungraceful, unable to manage yourself. You had to use just enough support to be safe, but not so much that you looked dependent. And if something went wrong? If you slipped on that muddy step? If your skirt caught on the door? If a sudden lurch of the carriage threw you off balance, the footman might catch you. But now you'd been in a man's arms, even briefly, even for safety, and depending on who saw, depending on how the story was told, this could become gossip. For women without footmen, without servants, the challenge was even greater. You had to manage entirely on your own, and if you fell, if you stumbled, you had to get up by yourself while people watched. The humiliation was immediate and public. But here is what makes this even more absurd. The reason carriage exits were so dangerous was because of fashion. Georgian gowns, especially in the Regency period, were made of light, flowing fabric that moved easily in the wind. This made them beautiful but impractical. A strong breeze could lift your skirt. Getting tangled in the carriage door could expose your legs. The very clothes designed to make you look elegant were also designed to create opportunities for immodesty. And remember, most Georgian women did not wear what we would call underwear. So if your skirt flew up, there was nothing underneath except your shift, a thin linen undergarment, and your stockings. The risk of exposure was real, and the consequences were serious. There are actual historical accounts of women whose reputations suffered because of carriage accidents. Not scandals in the modern sense, just accidents, moments of bad luck. But those moments were remembered, discussed, used as evidence of poor breeding or lack of control. One account from a Georgian diary describes a young woman who fell while exiting a carriage at a public assembly. The writer does not describe her as unlucky or sympathize with her embarrassment. Instead, the diary writer questions whether the young woman had been properly trained in deportment, suggests that a true lady would never have such an accident, and concludes that the young woman's family must be of questionable refinement. All from a simple fall. Think about the cruelty of that judgment. This woman did not choose to fall. She was not doing anything wrong. She was simply trying to get out of a carriage on a probably wet, definitely uneven surface while wearing impractical clothing. And instead of sympathy, she got judgment. Instead of help, she got gossip. This is why deportment training was so important for Georgian girls. They were taught how to move, how to sit, how to stand, how to walk, and yes, how to enter and exit vehicles. Hours of practice learning to manage their skirts, learning to maintain balance, learning to make it all look natural and effortless. Some families hired specific teachers for this, deportment masters who would come to the house and teach young ladies the proper way to carry themselves. They would practice with mock carriages, learning the exact sequence of movements. Gather skirt, hold frame, step down, release skirt, straighten posture, over and over until it became automatic. And this training extended to other situations too. How to climb stairs without lifting your skirt too high. How to sit down without your dress flying up. How to pick something up from the floor without bending over inappropriately. Every movement was choreographed, every gesture was planned, nothing was natural, everything was performance. Now let me tell you about what working class women did. They climbed in and out of farm carts, market wagons, mail coaches. They had shorter skirts because they needed mobility. They did not have footmen. They did not have time for elaborate carriage exiting rituals. They just got out. And sometimes they fell. And sometimes their skirts flew up. And society did not care because the rules were never really about modesty. They were about class performance. A farm girl could flash her knees climbing onto a hay wagon and nobody batted an eye. But a lady stumbling out of a private carriage with her ankle visible, scandal. The rules were different because the stakes were different. Working women were not performing gentility, they were working. They were expected to be practical, sturdy, unrefined. So their bodies, their movements, their accidents, they did not matter. But for upper-class women, the body was always under surveillance. Every movement was interpreted, judged, used as evidence of your character. You could not just exist in your body. You had to manage it, control it, choreograph it. And here is something interesting. Georgian fashion plates, those illustrated guides showing the latest styles, they often depicted women in graceful poses, standing elegantly, sitting prettily, always perfectly composed. But they rarely showed women actually doing things, getting into carriages, walking upstairs, moving through daily life. Because those moments were not elegant. They were complicated, awkward, difficult. The fashion plates showed the fantasy, not the reality. The reality was that Georgian women spent enormous amounts of energy just moving through space without causing scandal. And this was exhausting. Physically exhausting because you were always tense, always careful, always monitoring yourself. And emotionally exhausting because you could never relax, never just be. Do you ever feel that way? Like you are constantly being watched, constantly being judged, constantly performing. Like you cannot just exist, you have to manage how you exist. That feeling has been with women for centuries. The specifics change, the technologies change, but the underlying anxiety remains. How do I move through this world without being punished for having a body? Let me tell you about something that happened frequently. Women would simply stay in carriages rather than risk getting out. If a carriage stopped somewhere public, somewhere crowded, some women would choose to remain inside rather than attempt the dangerous exit. They would wait until they reached home, until they were somewhere private, somewhere safe. They would miss events, miss opportunities, miss experiences, because the risk of an immodest fall was too great. Can you imagine that? Choosing isolation over participation because the act of getting out of a vehicle was too socially dangerous. That is not caution. That is fear. That is a prison made of propriety. And men understood this risk, which is why offering to assist a lady from a carriage became a gesture of protection. A gentleman who helped a lady exit safely was performing a service, demonstrating his care and his understanding of the social minefield she was navigating. But this also meant women were dependent on men for safe navigation of public space. You needed male assistance to move through the world without scandal. Your autonomy was limited by your need for protection. Some Georgian etiquette books even suggested that ladies should avoid certain types of carriages altogether. High-perch phaetons, those fashionable sporting vehicles that sat very high off the ground, were considered dangerous for women. Not because they might crash, but because getting in and out of them was nearly impossible without exposing your legs. So women who wanted to drive, who wanted the freedom and excitement of handling their own vehicle, were discouraged from the very carriages that would give them that freedom. There were also rules about who could assist you. A footman was fine, a male family member was fine, but a gentleman you were not related to? That required careful consideration. If he touched your hand, your arm, your waist to steady you, that physical contact had meaning. It suggested familiarity. It implied a relationship. So you had to weigh the risk of falling immodestly against the risk of accepting improper assistance, and weather made everything worse. Rain made steps slippery. Wind made skirts unmanageable. Snow and ice made balance precarious. But you still had to exit the carriage. You still had to attend events, make calls, fulfill social obligations. You could not just stay home because the weather made modest carriage exits difficult. So you did your best and hoped luck was on your side. There is a wonderful satirical print from the 1820s that shows a woman attempting to exit a carriage in a windstorm. Her skirts are flying everywhere. Her hat is being blown off. She is clinging to the footman who looks completely overwhelmed. And the caption reads something like the perils of fashion. It is funny, but it is also true. The perils were real, and they were entirely created by the society that claimed to be protecting women. Let me share something else historians have found. They discovered that some women wore special underskirts, heavier petticoats that would weigh down their outer skirts and prevent them from flying up. This was not about warmth or modesty in general. It was specifically about managing the risk of exposure during moments like carriage exits. Women were literally adding weight to their clothing to protect themselves from accidental scandal. Think about how much mental energy went into this. You had to plan your clothing based on what you would be doing that day. If you were making multiple calls, multiple carriage trips, you needed heavier skirts. If it was windy, you needed to be even more careful. If you were going somewhere public, somewhere crowded, the stakes were higher. Every morning was a risk assessment exercise, and all this anxiety and effort and careful planning was so that you could perform one simple action that should have been unremarkable. Getting out of a vehicle, that is all. Just exiting transportation. But Georgian society had made it into a test of your character, your breeding, your worthiness as a woman. The carriage exit crisis, as ridiculous as it sounds, shows us something important about how Georgian reputation worked. It was not about what you did, it was about how you looked while doing it. You could be perfectly virtuous, perfectly proper, perfectly respectable, but if you looked ungraceful, if you had an awkward moment, if you lost control even briefly, that was enough to damage your reputation. Appearance mattered more than reality. And this brings us to something even more absurd, even more carefully controlled, even more impossible to navigate. Because if Georgian women could not even talk about carriage accident without euphemism, imagine what happened when they had to navigate actual biological realities. Pregnancy, childbirth, the basic functions of the human body. These things could not be ignored, but they also could not be acknowledged. And the linguistic gymnastics required to discuss the undiscussable created a whole new level of absurdity. There are some words you just cannot say in polite company. We all know this, right? Every era has its forbidden vocabulary, its unspeakable topics. But in Georgian England, the list of things you could not mention was so long, so comprehensive, so utterly ridiculous, that having a normal conversation became an exercise in creative euphemism. And the most forbidden topic of all? Pregnancy. You could not say the word pregnant. You absolutely could not. It was considered vulgar, crude, shockingly inappropriate. The word itself was banned from polite vocabulary, so what did people say instead? They developed an entire catalogue of euphemisms, each one more absurd than the last. A woman was not pregnant. She was in a delicate condition, she was in confinement, she was breeding, which honestly sounds like something you would say about livestock. She was in an interesting situation, she was increasing, she was expecting, she was indisposed, she was confined to her chambers. Anything, literally anything, except the actual medical term for what was happening to her body. And here is the truly bizarre part. Pregnancy was not just linguistically forbidden, it was visually forbidden too. Once a woman started to show, once her condition became visible, she was expected to disappear from public life. She would stop attending social events, she would stop making calls, she would stop being seen, she would retreat to her home and essentially vanish for months. This was called lying in, or confinement, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Confinement, imprisonment. A pregnant woman was confined to her home, to her chamber, to a small private world where polite society did not have to acknowledge what was happening to her body. Now, you might think this was about protecting pregnant women, giving them rest, keeping them safe. And sure, that was part of the stated reason. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous in an era before modern medicine. Many women died, many babies died. So there was genuine concern for health and safety, but the real reason for confinement was more insidious. It was about maintaining the fiction that reproduction did not exist, that babies just appeared magically without any messy biological process, that ladies were too refined, too delicate, too pure to engage in anything as physical as growing a human being inside their body. Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III, had 15 pregnancies. 15. She was pregnant for a significant portion of her adult life, and each time she disappeared from public view once she started to show. The Queen of England, one of the most powerful women in the country, had to hide because acknowledging her pregnancy would be improper. Think about that. The Queen herself, in her own palace, had to pretend she was not pregnant. She could not be seen, could not be acknowledged, could not participate in public life, because even royal pregnancy was too scandalous for polite society to witness. And this was not just for a few weeks. Women would disappear for months, sometimes 4 months, sometimes longer. They would miss entire seasons of social life, miss weddings, miss balls, miss everything. And when they reappeared, usually a month or so after giving birth, everyone would act as if nothing had happened, as if the baby had just spontaneously materialized, as if the previous months of absence were completely unremarkable. The etiquette around visiting new mothers was incredibly strict. You could not visit too soon after the birth. That would acknowledge that birth had happened, which was too crude. You had to wait until the woman had recovered enough to receive visitors, which usually meant at least a month. And when you did visit, you never ever mentioned the pregnancy or the birth. You admired the baby, you congratulated the mother on her new addition to the family, but you never discussed how that baby got there. Can you imagine going through pregnancy and childbirth, one of the most intense physical experiences a human can have, and not being allowed to talk about it? Not being allowed to share your experience, your fears, your pain, just having to smile and accept congratulations as if the baby appeared out of thin air. But here is where it gets worse. Working class women did not have the luxury of confinement. They could not afford to stop working for months. Farm women, shop workers, servants, they worked right up until labour started. They gave birth and went back to work as soon as physically possible. And society saw nothing wrong with this. So the rule was not really about protecting women. It was about maintaining class distinctions. Upper-class women were too delicate to be seen while pregnant. Working-class women were sturdy enough to work through it. The difference was not biological, it was social. It was about performing a certain kind of femininity that required pretending your body did not do anything as crude as reproduce. Let me tell you about the linguistic absurdity this created. Medical texts from the period, books written by doctors, had to dance around the topic of pregnancy. They would use terms like gestation, gravid, parturition, anything that sounded scientific and distant. They could not use plain language. They could not say a woman was pregnant and would give birth. That would be too direct, too acknowledging of physical reality. And conduct books, those guides for proper ladies, they barely mentioned pregnancy at all. Maybe a brief note that a married lady might find herself in a delicate condition and should consult her physician. That was it. No advice on what to expect, no guidance on how to care for yourself, no acknowledgement that this was a major life event. Just radio silence. So where did women learn about pregnancy and childbirth? From other women in private, in whisper conversations. Mothers would tell daughters, older sisters would tell younger sisters, friends would share experiences in letters that were carefully worded to avoid being too explicit. Knowledge was passed down through a network of women who had to educate each other because public discourse pretended pregnancy did not exist. And the danger of this silence was real. Women died from complications they did not understand because nobody had explained what was normal and what was not. Women suffered through difficult pregnancies alone because they were not supposed to complain, not supposed to acknowledge their condition. The silence was not just absurd, it was deadly. Now let me tell you about something even more bizarre. There were superstitions about what pregnant women could and could not do. If a pregnant woman looked at something frightening, the baby might be affected. If she looked at a fire, the baby might have a birthmark. If she was startled by an animal, the baby might resemble that animal. Yes, seriously. There were genuine fears that women might give birth to puppies or rabbits if they were frightened by dogs or rabbits during pregnancy. These were not fringe beliefs. These were mainstream concerns. Medical texts discussed them seriously. And these superstitions made pregnancy even more isolating because pregnant women were told to avoid anything that might damage the baby through the power of maternal imagination. So in addition to being physically confined, they were also restricted in what they could see, what they could think about, what they could experience. The idea was that a woman's mind had direct influence over the developing child. So she had to maintain only pure, uplifting thoughts. She had to avoid anything disturbing, anything ugly, anything frightening. She had to essentially exert in a carefully curated bubble of pleasant experiences, which, given that she was also supposed to be invisible to society, meant she spent months in isolation with nothing but cheerful thoughts. Do you know what that sounds like? Gaslighting. Society was telling pregnant women that their thoughts could harm their children, that any anxiety or fear or distress they felt was dangerous. So on top of all the physical challenges of pregnancy, they had the psychological burden of policing their own emotions. And here is something that breaks my heart. Women would write in their private diaries about their terror of pregnancy and childbirth. about their fear of dying, which was a real possibility, about their pain, their discomfort, their isolation. But they could never express these feelings publicly. They had to maintain a serene, cheerful demeanour. They had to pretend everything was wonderful. The pressure to perform happiness while going through something terrifying must have been unbearable. Let me tell you about Jane Austen and pregnancy. Jane never married, never had children, but she lived with her sister-in-law during several pregnancies, and she saw what it entailed. And in her letters she makes subtle, careful references to the difficulties of constant pregnancy. She mentions women who look tired, who seem unwell, who are confined to home. She never uses explicit language, because that would be improper, but you can read between the lines. She understood the toll it took, and in her novels she barely mentions pregnancy at all. Think about it. Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility, these are all stories about young women getting married. And marriage in the Georgian era inevitably led to pregnancy. But Austen ends her stories at the wedding. She does not follow her heroines into the reality of married life, into the reality of repeated pregnancies, because that reality was not romantic. It was not proper to discuss. So she stops the story where propriety requires. There is one exception. In Persuasion, there is a character named Mrs. Musgrove who is mentioned as being in a delicate situation. That is it. That is the entire reference. And it is notable precisely because it is so rare. Austen almost never acknowledged pregnancy in her fiction, because her fiction was meant for public consumption, and pregnancy was not a public topic. But here is what makes the whole thing even more absurd. Everyone knew that married women got pregnant. Everyone understood basic biology. The secret was not actually a secret. Everyone knew what confinement meant, what a delicate condition was, what increasing implied. The euphemisms were not fooling anyone, but society maintained the fiction anyway. Everyone played along with the pretense that reproduction was mysterious and unspeakable. It is like that old joke, right? Everyone knows what is happening, but we all agree to pretend we do not. The emperor has no clothes, but we all compliment his outfit anyway. Georgian society chose collective delusion over honesty, and this delusion extended to other bodily functions too. You could not mention menstruation, obviously. You could not discuss digestion or elimination. You could not acknowledge that bodies do things, ordinary things, necessary things. A lady was supposed to be essentially incorporeal, a floating spirit that happened to wear dresses but did not actually inhabit a physical form. The result was that women were completely alienated from their own bodies. They were not allowed to discuss what they experienced, what they felt, what was happening to them. They had to maintain this fiction of bodilessness while living in bodies that were doing very physical things. And men benefited from this system enormously, because if women could not talk about pregnancy, could not discuss the risks and realities, could not prepare or educate each other properly, then women remained dependent on male doctors, male advisors, male authorities. The silence kept women vulnerable and ignorant. But some women rebelled against this silence. Mary Wollstonecraft, the feminist writer, discussed pregnancy and motherhood more openly in her work. She argued that the silence around these topics harmed women, that education and honest discussion were necessary, and she was criticized for it. She was called vulgar, improper, unwomanly, because how dare she suggest that women should be allowed to discuss their own bodies? There were also midwives who maintained practical knowledge about pregnancy and birth. These women could not publish their knowledge widely, could not speak openly, but they passed information from woman to woman. They were lifelines, sources of real advice in a world of enforced ignorance. But they were also looked down upon by polite society because they dealt with bodies, with mess, with reality. The disconnect between reality and propriety was total. Women were dying from complications of pregnancy and childbirth that could have been prevented with better knowledge. But that knowledge could not be shared because sharing it would require acknowledging that pregnancy existed. The cost of propriety was measured in lives. And when women survived childbirth, when these emerged from confinement with their babies, they were expected to immediately return to their performative roles. Be graceful, be modest, be proper. No mention of what they had just been through. No acknowledgement of the physical toll. Just smile, present the baby, accept congratulations, and get back to being a decorative object. Do you ever feel like you are supposed to hide certain parts of your humanity? Like some experiences are too messy, too real, too physical to be acknowledged? That pressure to be presentable rather than honest, to perform rather than exist, it is still with us. We have just rebranded it. The Georgians called it propriety. We call it professionalism, or social media presence, or keeping it together. But it is the same silencing, the same demand that women edit themselves to be acceptable. Georgian women could not say pregnant. We can say it now, thankfully. But we still have our own forbidden topics, our own silences, our own performances of acceptability. Maybe we have more words available, but we still know what it feels like to censor ourselves, to hide parts of our experience, to maintain a fiction of who we are supposed to be instead of who we actually are. And speaking of performances and fictions, we have barely scratched the surface of what Georgian women were expected to master, because in addition to managing their bodies, their movements, their words, they also had to cultivate accomplishments, skills that proved they were marriageable, refined, valuable, skills that took years to learn and had absolutely no economic value whatsoever. So settle in, because we are about to enter the world of Georgian female education, where women were trained in everything except anything that might actually help them. What makes a woman accomplished? In our world today, maybe it is a degree, a career, expertise in something meaningful. But in Georgian England, being accomplished meant something entirely different. It meant you could play the pianoforte, you could sketch a landscape, you could sing, embroider, speak French and dance. And if you spent thousands of hours mastering these skills, if your family spent thousands of pounds on teachers and materials, you would have achieved something remarkable. You would have made yourself marriageable. That was it. That was the entire goal. Let me tell you about the accomplished woman trap. Because it was a trap, an elaborate system designed to consume years of a young woman's life, teaching her things that had no practical value whatsoever. Skills that proved you were refined, educated, worthy of a good marriage, but skills that could never earn you money, could never support you if that marriage did not happen or went badly, could never give you independence. There was actually a checklist. Society had a literal list of what an accomplished woman should be able to do, and Jane Austen, bless her satirical heart, spelled it out perfectly in Pride and Prejudice. Let me paraphrase what her characters say. An accomplished woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages. She must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions. And she must also improve her mind by extensive reading. Sounds like a lot, right? But wait, there is more. One character adds that to deserve the word accomplished, a woman must possess all this and something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. So you had to master multiple art forms, multiple languages, perfect your deportment and be widely read. All of this, all of it was required to be considered accomplished, to be considered marriageable. And here is the cruelest part. Even if you achieved all of this, even if you spent your entire youth practicing piano scales and conjugating French verbs and learning watercolour techniques, you still might not be considered accomplished enough, because there was always someone who could play better, speak more languages, paint more beautifully. The standards were impossible, and they were designed to be impossible. Let me walk you through what this actually looked like in a Georgian girl's life. From about age 7 or 8, sometimes younger, your education would begin. You would have governesses, tutors, masters. The governess taught you basic academics, reading and writing and arithmetic, though not too much arithmetic because that was considered masculine. The music master came several times a week to teach you piano or harp. The drawing master taught you to sketch and paint in watercolours. The dancing master taught you the latest dances. The language master taught you French, maybe Italian if your family was particularly ambitious. And you practiced, hours every day, sitting at the piano, repeating exercises until your fingers ached, standing in uncomfortable positions while learning to sketch perspective, memorizing French vocabulary, practicing dance steps in your drawing room. This was your childhood. This was your adolescence, years of your life spent acquiring accomplishments. And what did these accomplishments actually do? They made you attractive to potential husbands. That was the function. You performed your accomplishments at social gatherings. Someone would ask you to play and you would sit at the piano and demonstrate your skill. Or you would show your sketchbook, your watercolours, proof that you had been properly educated. These performances were auditions. Men were judging whether you were accomplished enough to be a suitable wife. But here is what breaks my heart about this system. Many Georgian women genuinely loved their accomplishments. They found real joy in music, in art, in learning languages. These skills gave them pleasure, gave them a way to express themselves in a world that limited their expression in every other way. But even that joy was tainted because it could never be just for them. It always had to be performance, always had to be for someone else's approval. Let me tell you about the cost. Hiring all these masters, buying instruments and art supplies, providing the time and space for practice, this was expensive, extraordinarily expensive. Only wealthy families could afford to make their daughters truly accomplished. Middle-class families had to choose. Maybe they could afford a piano and music lessons, but not a drawing master. Maybe they could hire a French tutor, but their daughter would have to practice dancing by watching others at assemblies. And this created a market hierarchy. The more accomplished you were, the more valuable you were considered, the better marriage you could expect. But the more accomplished you were, the more money your family had already spent on you. So accomplishments both increased your value and advertised your family's wealth. It was a class marker disguised as education. Now let me tell you what was not included in this list of accomplishments. Anything practical, anything that might actually help you survive in the world. You were not taught how to manage money, how to run a household budget, how to negotiate with tradesmen. You were not taught anything about the law, about property rights, about contracts. You learned French poetry, but not how the world actually worked. And most importantly, you were not taught anything that could earn you money. Because ladies did not work, ladies did not have professions. The accomplishments were specifically designed to be useless in any economic sense. They proved you came from a family wealthy enough that you would never need to work. They proved you could be an ornament, a decoration, a status symbol for your future husband. But they could never save you if that future did not materialize. This meant that if you did not marry, if you became a spinster, you had years of training in skills that could not support you. You could play the piano beautifully, but nobody would pay you to do it. Not a lady. Professional musicians were working class, not genteel. You could paint lovely watercolours, but you could not. Ladies did not sell their art. You could speak perfect French, but you could not work as a translator. That would be beneath you. Your only option, if you needed to support yourself and maintain some level of respectability, was to become a governess. to teach other girls the same useless accomplishments you had learned. And being a governess was miserable. You lived in someone else's home, not quite a servant but not quite family, in a strange liminal space where you belonged nowhere. You earned a tiny salary, barely enough to survive, and you were trapped there because you had no other skills, no other options. Jane Austen understood this perfectly. She never married. She lived on the charity of her brothers for most of her life, and the anxiety of that dependence, the fear of poverty, the awareness that she had no real skills that could support her, that runs through all her novels. Her heroines need to marry not just for love, but for survival, because unmarried women with no money had no good options. But let me tell you about something even more frustrating. Some women were genuinely talented, genuinely gifted musicians, artists, writers, and they had to hide that talent because displaying too much skill was considered unladylike. You were supposed to be accomplished, yes, but not too accomplished. Not so good that you outshone the men, not so skilled that it looked like you cared too much, like you were trying too hard. There was a sweet spot. You had to be good enough to attract attention, but not so good that you seemed professional. Because professionals were lower class. True ladies were effortlessly accomplished. They were naturally talented. They never had to work at it, never had to practice obsessively, never had to strive, or at least they had to pretend they never did. This is why Pride and Prejudice is so brilliant, so cutting in its discussion of accomplishments. When the characters debate what makes a woman accomplished, they are revealing the absurdity of the whole system. The list is impossible. Nobody could actually achieve all of it without dedicating their entire life to it. But everyone pretends that accomplished women just naturally possess all these skills, that true ladies are born knowing how to play the pianoforte and speak French and paint watercolours. And Elizabeth Bennet, Austen's heroine, she is deliberately not fully accomplished. She plays piano but not brilliantly. She reads extensively, which is considered unfeminine by some characters. She walks 3 miles through muddy fields to visit her sick sister, arriving with dirty hems and flushed cheeks, completely unconcerned with how she looks. And Mr. Darcy falls in love with her anyway, precisely because she is not performing accomplishment. She is being herself. But Elizabeth can only afford to be herself because she is the heroine of a novel. Real Georgian women did not have that luxury. They had to perform, had to demonstrate their accomplishments, had to compete for husbands in a marketplace where their years of expensive training were the product being sold. Let me tell you about the Bennet sisters specifically, because they show us the range of how this system could play out. Jane is beautiful and sweet, but not particularly accomplished, and she nearly misses her chance at marriage because her family's poverty is visible. Elizabeth is intelligent and witty, but not fully accomplished, and she succeeds through personality rather than performance. Mary is the most accomplished, practicing piano constantly, but her desperate need for attention makes her annoying rather than attractive. Kitty and Lydia have barely any accomplishments at all because their mother focused on their looks instead of their education, and Lydia's lack of accomplishments contributes to her making terrible decisions. Austen is showing us that the accomplishments do not actually matter. They do not make you happy. They do not guarantee a good marriage. They do not protect you. They are just another form of performance, another way society controls and judges women. But here is what is fascinating. Despite all this criticism, despite understanding how absurd the system was, Georgian women still practiced, still learned, still performed. Because what choice did they have? You could recognize that the game was rigged and still have to play it. You could know that accomplishments were meaningless and still need them to survive, and some women found ways to subvert the system. They used their musical skills to make money carefully, quietly in ways that did not look professional. They used their art to document their lives, their thoughts, their observations. They used their language skills to read forbidden books, to access ideas that English society tried to keep from them. They turned their accomplishments into actual education, into genuine skill, into tools for understanding the world. But they had to do this secretly, carefully, without anyone knowing. Because the accomplishments were supposed to be shallow, decorative, useless. Actually, using them for something meaningful would be improper. There were also women who simply refused, who said, "I am not spending years learning to paint flowers I do not care about," who chose to read instead of practice piano, who learned things they actually wanted to learn, rather than things society demanded. And these women were punished. They were called unaccomplished, unmarriageable, difficult. They were social failures. Mary Wollstonecraft, that feminist writer I mentioned earlier, she wrote extensively about the trap of female accomplishments. She argued that training women in useless skills kept them dependent, kept them ignorant, kept them powerless. She said women should be educated in practical subjects, in mathematics and science and philosophy. They should be trained for independence, not for ornamental display, and she was mocked for this. She was called unfeminine, radical, dangerous, because suggesting that women should be educated for themselves rather than for men, that was threatening, that was revolutionary. That challenged the entire structure of Georgian society, which depended on women being decorative and dependent. Now let me ask you something. Do you ever feel like you are collecting accomplishments for someone else? Like you are building a resume of skills not because you care about them, but because they make you more marketable, more acceptable, more valuable in someone else's eyes? That feeling, that exhausting performance of being accomplished, it did not die with the Georgians. We just moved it from the pianos to LinkedIn profiles. The specifics have changed. We are not learning watercolors anymore, but we are still trapped in systems that demand we constantly prove our worth through skills and performances that may or may not actually matter to us. We are still judged, still evaluated, still in competition to be accomplished enough. The Georgians thought they were educating women, but they were actually training performers, decorative objects, marketable products. And the tragedy is that real education was happening anyway, despite the system, through women teaching each other, learning in secret, using their accomplishments for more than just performance. But that education was unofficial, unrecognized, invisible to the society that only valued the performance. And that brings us to one of the darkest aspects of the Georgian reputation system. Because if accomplishments were about what you could do, reputation was about what you could not say. There were topics so forbidden, so completely off limits, that even mentioning them could mark you as coarse, vulgar, unrefined. And navigating these conversational minefields required the strategic mind of a diplomat and the verbal dexterity of a poet. So let us venture now into the dangerous territory of Georgian conversation, where saying the wrong thing did not just end the discussion, it could end your social life entirely. Conversation is an art, they told Georgian women. The ability to maintain pleasant, engaging discourse was considered one of the essential skills of a refined lady. But here is what they did not tell you. It was an art performed on a stage surrounded by landmines, where one wrong word could blow up your entire social standing. Because the list of acceptable topics for conversation was incredibly short, and the list of forbidden topics, that was endless. Let me tell you what you could not discuss. Money, never, ever money. How much things cost, what you earned, what your family was worth, how much debt anyone carried, all forbidden. Even though money determined everything in Georgian society, who you could marry, where you could live, what kind of life you could have, you could not talk about it. Discussing money was vulgar, crass, the mark of someone who was not truly genteel. Politics? Absolutely not. Ladies did not have opinions about governance, about war, about policy. Those were masculine topics. If conversation turned political, you were expected to remain silent or change the subject. Expressing political views marked you as unfeminine, aggressive, inappropriately interested in matters beyond your sphere. Religion, too controversial. You could mention church attendance, you could discuss sermons in the most superficial way, but you could not debate theology, could not question doctrine, could not express doubt. Religion was supposed to be a given, unexamined, undiscussed. Death, not really discussable except in the most euphemistic terms. Someone had passed away, had departed this life, had gone to their reward. You did not talk about the actual process of dying, the grief, the fear, the reality of mortality. That would be morbid. Illness. You could say someone was unwell, indisposed, but you could not discuss symptoms, treatments, the messy reality of disease. Bodies, as we have established, did not exist in polite conversation. And then there were the really forbidden topics. Anything sexual, obviously. Anything relating to the body or its functions. Anything scandalous. You could gossip, but only in the most veiled, indirect way. You could hint, you could imply, but you could never say directly what you meant. So what could you talk about? The weather, always say how pleasant the sunshine is today. What a lovely breeze we are having. Books, but only certain kinds of books. Novels were considered frivolous, possibly corrupting. Poetry was better. Travel, but only if discussed in terms of picturesque landscapes and elegant accommodations, never in terms of actual experience or adventure. Music and art. Fashion to some degree. Mutual acquaintances, but only with the utmost discretion. Nature, gardens, flowers. And that was about it. That was the entire approved catalogue of conversation topics for respectable women. Can you imagine? Imagine spending your entire life making small talk about the weather and wildflowers. Imagine having thoughts, opinions, questions, fears, dreams, and not being able to express any of them. Imagine every conversation being a performance of pleasantness, never an actual exchange of ideas. This is why conduct books emphasize the art of pleasing conversation. They did not mean interesting conversation. They meant inoffensive conversation. Conversation that did not challenge, did not provoke, did not reveal anything real about the speaker. Conversation as a form of social lubrication, keeping interaction smooth and meaningless. And women were trained in this art. They learned to redirect conversations away from dangerous topics. They learned to change the subject gracefully when discussions ventured into forbidden territory. They learned to speak at length while saying nothing of substance. It was a skill, genuinely. A complicated, exhausting skill. Let me give you an example from Jane Austen again, because she was a master at showing how this worked. In Pride and Prejudice, there is a scene where Elizabeth is visiting Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine asks intrusive questions about Elizabeth's family, their property, their income, and Elizabeth has to answer without appearing offended, without discussing money directly, without revealing how inappropriate the questions are. She dances around the topics, gives vague responses, maintains politeness while essentially saying nothing. It is conversational combat disguised as pleasantries. And then there is Mr. Collins, that ridiculous clergyman. He talks constantly but says nothing meaningful. He offers compliments that are actually condescending. He discusses his patroness Lady Catherine in exhaustive, boring detail. He is Austen's satire of what polite conversation had become. Empty, performative, utterly devoid of genuine connection. But here is what makes this even more complicated. You are supposed to be interesting without being controversial. You are supposed to engage people without expressing actual opinions. You are supposed to be intelligent but not too intelligent. Witty but not sharp. Conversational but not dominating. It was an impossible balance. If you were too quiet, you were dull, boring, not worth talking to. If you were too talkative, you were domineering, unfeminine, inappropriately forward. If you were too clever, you were intimidating, showing off, trying to compete with men. If you were too agreeable, you were insipid, without personality, unmemorable. The Goldilocks zone of acceptable female conversation was narrow and constantly shifting, and different social circles had slightly different rules. What was acceptable in a country assembly might be too informal for a London drawing room. What passed for wit in one family might be considered vulgar in another. So you had to read the room constantly, adjust your conversation to the specific audience, never knowing for certain if you were getting it right. Let me tell you about gossip, because gossip was one of the few topics women were allowed to discuss freely. And gossip was powerful. It was how reputations were made and destroyed. It was how information spread, how social boundaries were enforced, how women exerted what little power they had. But even gossip had rules. You could not be too direct. You had to hint, imply, suggest. You might say, "I saw Miss So-and-so walking with Mr. Such, and they seemed very friendly." That was acceptable. But you could not say, "I think Miss So-and-so is having an affair with Mr. Such. That would be slander, dangerous, potentially actionable. And there was good gossip and bad gossip. Good gossip was sharing information about engagements, marriages, births, social events. Bad gossip was spreading rumours about scandals, impropriety, moral failings. Good gossip enhanced your reputation as someone who was well-connected and informed. Bad gossip marked you as malicious, untrustworthy, not a proper lady. But everyone engaged in both kinds. Everyone. The difference was in how you did it, how you framed it, whether you got caught. There is a wonderful account from a Georgian letter where a woman writes to her sister about some local scandal, and she phrases it like this: "I hardly know how to tell you what I have heard. It is so shocking, but I feel you ought to know." And then she proceeds to tell every single detail with obvious relish, while maintaining the pretense that she is reluctant to share such terrible news. It is gossip disguised as concern, and it is absolutely perfect Georgian doublespeak. Now let me tell you about what happened when you violated these conversational rules. If you expressed a political opinion, men might be amused or condescending. They might pat you on the head metaphorically and explain why you were wrong. They might dismiss you entirely. Other women might distance themselves from you, worried that your impropriety would reflect on them. If you discussed money, people would mark you as vulgar, lower class, not really genteel. Even if you were talking about your own desperate financial situation, even if you needed help, discussing it openly was worse than staying silent. If you were too clever, too witty, too interesting, men might enjoy your company but not consider you marriage material. You would become the entertaining spinster, the woman who was fun at parties but never quite respectable enough to marry. And if you were caught in actual scandal in discussing something truly forbidden, your conversational options became even more limited. Because everyone would know, everyone would have heard, and they would all be carefully not mentioning it while simultaneously thinking about nothing else. This is where the coldly polite technique came in. When a woman wanted to express disapproval, when she wanted someone to know they had violated social rules, she would become coldly polite. Her words would be perfectly proper, her tone would be icy, and the message would be clear. You have transgressed. You're not welcome. Leave. Conduct manuals actually taught this technique. How to be cutting while maintaining perfect manners. How to socially execute someone without ever saying anything directly rude. It was assassination by politeness, and it was devastatingly effective. Let me tell you about Lady Caroline Lamb. She was a noble woman married to William Lamb, who would later become Prime Minister. and Caroline had an affair with Lord Byron, the famous poet. It was the scandal of the early 1800s, but what made it worse was that Caroline talked about it. She did not hide her feelings, she pursued Byron publicly, she wrote him passionate letters that other people saw, she expressed her obsession openly, and society destroyed her for it. Not just for having the affair, though that was bad enough, but for talking about it, for expressing desire, passion, feeling, for being unable to maintain the cold mask of propriety. She was called mad, hysterical, uncontrolled. She was ostracized. Her reputation never recovered. And much of the damage came not from what she did, but from what she said. Meanwhile, Byron had affairs with dozens of women, talked about them constantly, wrote poetry about them, and he was celebrated for it. He was the romantic genius, the fascinating bad boy. The double standard was absolute. This is what Georgian conversation rules really did. They kept women silent about their experiences, their feelings, their lives. They made sure that anything real, anything true, anything uncomfortable could never be expressed. They maintained a surface of pleasantness that hid all the suffering, all the injustice, all the reality underneath. But some women found ways to speak anyway. They wrote letters where they could be more honest. They had close friends, confidants, with whom they could share their actual thoughts. They wrote in journals that nobody was supposed to see. They found cracks in the system where truth could slip through. And some women used the approved conversational forms subversively. They became masters of subtext, of implication, of saying one thing and meaning another. They learned to communicate in code, to share information and ideas while maintaining plausible deniability. Jane Austen did this brilliantly in her novels. Her characters speak in the approved forms of polite conversation, but the subtext is blistering. Elizabeth Bennet's conversations with Lady Catherine are perfectly polite on the surface, but underneath they are battles. Emma's conversations with Mr. Knightley follow all the rules, but they're also genuine exchanges of ideas, real discussions. Austen showed that meaningful conversation was possible even within the constraints, but it required skill, intelligence, and finding people who understood the game you were playing. Do you ever feel like you are speaking in code? Like you have to translate your actual thoughts into acceptable language before you can say them? Like there are things you know but cannot say, feelings you have but cannot express? That exhaustion, that constant translation, that performance of acceptable conversation, it is still with us. We just have different forbidden topics, different approved scripts. The Georgians could not talk about money, politics, or bodies. We can talk about those things more freely, but we have our own taboos, our own conversational landmines. We still perform pleasantness while hiding struggle. We still code switch, still adjust our conversation to our audience, still wonder if we are saying too much or too little. And that brings us to perhaps the most brutal aspect of the Georgian reputation system. Because all these rules, all these performances, all these impossible standards, they could all be undone in an instant. One mistake, one scandal, one moment of bad luck or a bad judgment, and your entire life could collapse. Your reputation, that fragile, precious thing you had spent years protecting, could be destroyed overnight. And once it was gone, it could never be recovered. Never. So prepare yourself, because we're about to enter the darkest territory of all, the world of irreversible ruin. Ruin. That was the word they used. A ruined woman. As if she were a building that had collapsed, a structure that could never be rebuilt. And in Georgian England, that is exactly what it meant. Once your reputation was destroyed, once you were ruined, there was no recovery. No redemption, no second chance. You were simply erased from respectable society, condemned to exist in the shadows for the rest of your life. And the terrifying part, You could be ruined for almost anything. An affair, obviously, but also a broken engagement, being alone with a man unchaperoned, being seen leaving a man's lodgings, being accused of impropriety, even if the accusation was false, being the victim of assault. Yes, you heard that right. If you were assaulted, you were ruined. Not the man who assaulted you, because your virtue had been compromised, and compromised virtue, regardless of how it happened, made you unmarriageable. The logic was brutal and absolute. A woman's value was her reputation, and her reputation was her virginity, and her virginity was something that once lost, for any reason, could never be recovered. So a ruined woman had no value. She could not marry a respectable man, she could not participate in society. She was a cautionary tale, a warning to other women about what happened when you failed to protect your reputation carefully enough. Let me tell you about Lady Seymour Worsley. Her story shows us exactly how the ruin machine worked, and how grotesque it could be. Seymour was married to Sir Richard Worsley, a wealthy baronet. The marriage was not happy. Richard was controlling and cold, so Seymour began an affair with George Bissay, one of Richard's friends. In 1782, Seymour and Bissay eloped together. They ran away, planning to live together despite the scandal. Richard was furious, but not because he loved his wife or was heartbroken. No, he was furious because his property had been damaged. Because that is what a wife was under Georgian law: property. So Richard sued Bissay for criminal conversation, which was the legal term for adultery. He was essentially suing Bissay for damaging his property by sleeping with his wife. Richard expected to win a huge settlement, £20,000, an enormous sum, but then the trial happened and it became a public spectacle. Richard's lawyer tried to prove that Seymour had been a virtuous wife before Bissay seduced her, that she had been valuable property that Bissay had ruined. But witnesses came forward with a different story. They testified that Richard had shown Seymour off to other men, that he had encouraged other men to look at her, to desire her. One witness testified that Richard had actually helped him climb up to peek through a window at Seymour while she was bathing. Richard had pimped out his own wife, displayed her body to his friends, encouraged her to have affairs. And now he was trying to sue one of those friends for taking him up on the offer. The jury was disgusted. They awarded Richard only 1 shilling in damages. 1 shilling, the symbolic smallest amount possible. It was a public humiliation for Richard. But do you know who suffered most, Seymour? Her private life had been exposed in court. Her affairs, her body, her bathing habits, all of it made public. She was humiliated, scandalous, completely ruined. She could never return to respectable society. And Richard, despite losing the case, despite being exposed as the terrible husband, he went on fine. He remarried. He retained his position in society. But Seymour was erased. This is what ruin looked like. It did not matter that she had been mistreated. It did not matter that her husband had essentially prostituted her to his friends. What mattered was that she had lost her reputation, and therefore she had no value, and therefore she was socially dead. Let me tell you about another kind of ruin, the broken engagement. If a courtship ended, if an engagement was called off, the woman's reputation suffered even if she was not at fault. Because people assumed there must be a reason. Maybe he discovered something scandalous about her. Maybe she was not really a virgin. Maybe her dowry was not what he expected. Whatever the reason, the assumption was that she was damaged goods. And here is the cruelest part. If the man broke the engagement, the woman could sue him for breach of promise. She could potentially win money. But she would have to go to court, have her private letters read aloud, have her feelings exposed, be publicly humiliated. And even if she won, even if she got the money, her reputation was still ruined, because everyone would know she had been rejected. Everyone would know she had been engaged, and then it had ended. And that mark, that stain, would follow her forever. But women chose not to sue. They chose to accept the broken engagement quietly, retreat from society, hope that maybe, eventually, someone else might be willing to marry damaged goods. But often nobody was. Often a broken engagement meant permanent spinsterhood. And if the woman broke the engagement, then she was heartless, fickle, a flirt who had led a man on and then cruelly rejected him. She was the villain. She might escape legal consequences, but social consequences were severe. Other men would be wary of courting her. Other women would judge her. She would be marked as someone who could not be trusted, who did not keep her word. There was no winning. End an engagement for any reason, and the woman suffered. Now let me tell you about the most horrifying kind of ruin. What happened to women who were assaulted, who were victims of violence? In Georgian England, if you were raped, you were ruined. Not the rapist, necessarily. You, because you were no longer a virgin, and therefore you were no longer marriageable, and therefore you had no value. There are court records from the period where women reported assaults, and the defense lawyers argued that the women must have consented because they did not scream loudly enough, did not fight hard enough, did not do enough to prevent the assault. The burden was entirely on the victim to prove she had resisted sufficiently. And even if she proved it, even if the man was convicted, she was still ruined. Her virtue was compromised. She could not marry. Her life was over. Some women who were assaulted did not report it because they knew reporting would only make things worse. Better to stay silent, hide the assault, hope nobody found out. Because if people knew, if the story spread, you would be blamed. You must have done something to encourage him. You must have been alone with him inappropriately. You must have led him on. It was always the woman's fault. This is the system Georgian women lived under. A system where being a victim could destroy you as thoroughly as being a perpetrator. Where your reputation was so fragile that bad luck, bad circumstances, bad people could shatter it irreparably. And once you were ruined, what were your options? You could not marry a respectable man. You could not participate in society. You could not hold your head up in public. So what did ruined women do? Some became courtesans. If you were going to be treated as a woman of loose morals anyway, you might as well profit from it. Courtesans were kept women, mistresses of wealthy men. They lived in nice houses, wore beautiful clothes, attended the theatre and opera. But they were not respectable. They were tolerated but not accepted. And their lives depended entirely on male patronage. If their keeper lost interest, if he died, if he went bankrupt, they had nothing. Some ruined women just disappeared. They moved to different towns where nobody knew them. They changed their names. They tried to build new lives. But this required money, connections, resources most women did not have. Some became governesses or companions, living on the edges of respectable society, never quite belonging anywhere. Their ruin might not be widely known, but it hung over them, a secret that could be exposed at any time, and some just descended into poverty. Ruined women with no resources, no family willing to support them, no options. They ended up in workhouses, in slums, in desperate circumstances. Ruin was not just social death. For many women, it led to actual literal poverty and suffering. There is an exhibition that was held at the Royal Crescent in Bath, curated by historian Hallie Rubenhold. It was called Ruin and Reputation in the Georgian Era. And one of the things the exhibition displayed was a chart from the period called Gradations of Whores. It was a hierarchy that ranked women from the most virtuous to the most fallen, and the message was clear. All women existed on this scale. You were always just one step away from sliding down into disgrace. Duchesses, respectable wives, they were at the top, but one scandal could drop them down. And below them were women of questionable virtue, and below them were kept women, and at the bottom were common prostitutes. And the exhibition placed all these women side by side in portraits and prints, showing that Georgian society saw all women as existing on a spectrum of virtue and vice, constantly at risk of falling. Can you imagine living with that anxiety? Knowing that your entire future, your entire life depended on maintaining a reputation that could be destroyed in an instant. That one wrong move, one piece of bad luck, one malicious rumor could send you spiraling down that hierarchy into ruin. And the most frustrating part was that men did not face the same consequences. A man could have affairs, could gamble, could visit prostitutes, could be known for scandalous behavior, and he might be gossiped about, but he would not be ruined. He could still marry, he could still participate in society, he could still hold positions of power and respect. The double standard was absolute. Women were held to impossible standards of virtue. Men were given unlimited freedom to transgress. And this was not an accident. It was how the system maintained control. Keep women afraid, keep them carefully managing their reputations, keep them dependent on male approval and male protection, and they will never challenge the system, never demand equality, never fight for freedom. But here is what gives me hope about this story. Some women did challenge it. Some women looked at the ruin machine and said, "I refuse to be destroyed by this. I refuse to let one mistake, one scandal, one moment define my entire existence." Let me tell you about a few of them. We have already talked about Mary Wollstonecraft, the feminist writer. Mary had a child out of wedlock. She was completely ruined by Georgian standards. But she kept writing, she kept advocating for women's rights, she kept living boldly and publicly. She eventually married William Godwin, and they were happy until she died shortly after giving birth to their daughter, the girl who would grow up to be Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft's life was not easy. She faced constant criticism, constant judgment, but she refused to disappear. She refused to accept that ruin meant the end of her life, her work, her voice. And there were other women who made similar choices. Women who were caught in scandals, who were publicly humiliated, who were told they were ruined, and who responded by living anyway. By finding ways to survive, to create, to build lives outside the bounds of respectability. Some of these women became writers, using pseudonyms, publishing their work anonymously or under male names. Some became artists, musicians, finding ways to use their skills professionally, even though professional women were looked down upon. Some became activists, using their outsider status to fight for change precisely because they had nothing left to lose. They were not always successful. They often lived difficult, painful lives, but they lived. They refused to be erased. They refused to accept that society's judgment was the final word on their worth. And that is the real lesson of the Georgian ruin machine. It was designed to control women through fear. Fear of scandal, fear of judgment, fear of losing everything. And it worked on many women. They spent their lives terrified, carefully managing every moment, every word, every action to avoid ruin. But it did not work on everyone. Some women chose courage over caution, some women chose authenticity over reputation. Some women decided that a life lived in fear was not really a life at all. And slowly, gradually, over decades and centuries, those women chipped away at the system. They challenged the rules, questioned the standards, refused to accept that women's worth should be measured by an impossible standard of virtue that men were never held to. The Georgian era eventually gave way to the Victorian era, which had its own oppressive rules, and the Victorian era gave way to the 20th century, which brought new freedoms but also new challenges. The specifics have changed, but the underlying tension remains. How much of ourselves do we sacrifice to be acceptable? How much do we conform to avoid punishment? How much freedom are we willing to risk for authenticity? These are questions Georgian women asked, and they are questions we still ask today. We still navigate reputation, still manage how we are perceived, still face consequences for transgressing social norms. The rules are different, the punishments are different, but the dynamic remains. And that brings us to the final chapter of our Georgian journey. Because despite all these oppressive rules, despite the constant surveillance and the threat of ruin, some women chose rebellion. They looked at the system designed to contain them and said no. They travelled where women were not supposed to travel. They did what women were not supposed to do. They lived how women were not supposed to live. And their stories show us that even in the most restrictive times, freedom is possible if you are brave enough, bold enough, stubborn enough to claim it. Heroes do not always wear armour. Sometimes they wear empire waist gowns and travel boots. Sometimes they carry parasols instead of swords. Sometimes they fight systems instead of armies. And in Georgian England, where women were told their entire purpose was to be decorative, obedient and silent, the real heroes were the women who looked at those instructions and said, "Absolutely not. Let me introduce you to Lady Hester Stanhope. If you have not heard of her, that is a crime, because Hester was one of the most extraordinary women of the Georgian era. She was born in 1776 into an aristocratic family. Her uncle was William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister. So Hester grew up in political circles, listening to debates about governance and war and policy, all the things women were not supposed to care about. But Hester cared. She had opinions, she was intelligent, sharp, interested in the world. And when her uncle became Prime Minister, she became his hostess. She managed his household, entertained political guests, participated in discussions. For a while she had a taste of the life she wanted, a life where her mind mattered. But then her uncle died, and Hester, who was unmarried, who had no husband to support her, found herself with a small pension and no real place in society. She was expected to live quietly, probably as a companion to some other family member, fading into respectable invisibility. Instead, Hester left England. She sailed to the Mediterranean. She travelled to Greece, to Egypt, to the Ottoman Empire. She wore men's clothing when it was practical. She learned Arabic. She rode horses across deserts. She met with tribal leaders, with pashas, with people who had never seen an English woman travel alone before. And when I say alone, I mean without a husband, without male family members controlling her movements. She had servants, yes, and travelling companions, but she was in charge. She made her own decisions. She went where she wanted to go. In 1813, Hester did something almost unbelievable. She travelled to Palmyra, ancient ruins in the Syrian desert. She was the first European woman known to visit the site, and when she arrived, the local Bedouin tribes held a ceremony. They crowned her Queen of the Desert. They gave her the title Meleki, their queen. They respected her courage, her boldness, her refusal to follow the rules that said women should stay home. Hester eventually settled in Lebanon, built a compound on Mount Lebanon where she lived for the rest of her life. She became involved in local politics. She sheltered refugees. She studied mysticism, astrology, ancient prophecies. She lived exactly as she wanted, accountable to no one. And England was scandalized. The newspapers wrote about her. They called her eccentric, strange, improper. They mocked her for wearing Turkish trousers, for travelling without a chaperone, for having the audacity to live independently. But Hester did not care. She had chosen freedom over reputation, and she never regretted it. She died in 1839, alone in her Lebanese compound, deeply in debt, but absolutely free. And her story reminds us that even in the most restrictive times, women could choose themselves. They could choose adventure over safety, authenticity over acceptability, freedom over approval. Now let me tell you about Mary Wollstonecraft, whose name we have mentioned several times tonight, because she deserves the full story. Mary was born in 1759 into a middle-class family that was sliding into poverty. Her father was abusive and alcoholic. She had to work to support herself from a young age. She became a governess, a teacher, a companion, all those limited options for unmarried women. But Mary also started writing. She wrote essays, reviews, translations. She taught herself multiple languages. She educated herself in philosophy, politics, literature, and in 1792 she published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, one of the earliest and most important feminist texts ever written. In this book, Mary argued that women were not naturally inferior to men. They were only made to seem inferior by lack of education. She argued that women should be educated in the same subjects as men, should have access to the same opportunities, should be treated as rational human beings rather than decorative objects. She argued that the accomplishment system was a trap designed to keep women dependent and ignorant. She argued for revolution in how society viewed and treated women. And the response? She was called a hyena in petticoats. She was mocked, criticized, dismissed as unfeminine and radical. But she kept writing, she kept arguing, she kept insisting that women deserved better. Mary also lived according to her principles. She had a relationship with a man and had a daughter out of wedlock. She was completely ruined by conventional standards, but she refused to hide. She kept working, kept writing, kept living publicly. She eventually married William Godwin, a philosopher who shared her radical views, and she died at age 38, shortly after giving birth to her second daughter, the baby who would grow up to be Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft's life was not easy, but she changed the world. Her ideas influenced generations of feminists. She proved that women could be philosophers, could be political theorists, could contribute meaningfully to public discourse. She refused to accept the limits society placed on her, and she spent her life fighting to expand those limits for all women. Let me tell you about the ladies of Llangollen, Lady Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby. They met in Ireland in the 1770s. They fell in love, and in 1778 they ran away together. They left their families, left Ireland, and settled in a cottage in Wales called Plasnwyd. They lived there together for over 50 years. They called themselves romantic friends, which was the acceptable term for intimate female relationships. They wore men's clothing, they studied, they read, they gardened. They lived exactly as they pleased together, accountable to no one. And the fascinating thing is that society mostly accepted them. They became famous. People came to visit them to see the two women who had chosen each other over marriage, who had built a life outside conventional structures. Poets wrote about them, aristocrats called on them. They were considered eccentric but respectable, bizarre but admirable. Their story shows that Georgian society had some flexibility, some space for women who refused to marry, who chose unconventional lives. As long as you maintained certain proprieties, as long as you framed your rebellion in acceptable ways, you could carve out freedom. And then there is Jane Austen herself. Jane never married. She lived with her family, dependent on her brothers for financial support. But she wrote. She wrote 6 novels that changed literature forever. She wrote stories that exposed the absurdities of Georgian society, that showed the traps women faced, that revealed the hypocrisy of the reputation system. Jane could not publish under her own name. Her novels were published anonymously by a lady. She could not claim credit publicly, but she wrote anyway. She created Elizabeth Bennet, who walked 3 miles through mud to care for her sister. She created Emma, who was intelligent and flawed and human. She created Anne Elliot, who got a second chance at love in her late 20s, ancient by Georgian standards. She created heroines who thought, who chose, who mattered. And through her novels, Jane fought back against the system that constrained her. She could not vote, could not own property, could not control her own money, but she could write, and she used that weapon brilliantly. These women, Hester and Mary and Eleanor and Sarah and Jane, they were not perfect. They made mistakes. They faced consequences. They suffered for their choices, but they chose anyway. They decided that living authentically was worth the cost. They refused to let fear control them. They refused to accept that their value was determined by reputation, by marriage, by male approval, and they were not alone. There were hundreds, probably thousands of Georgian women whose names we do not know, who made small rebellions every day. Women who read forbidden books. Women who had opinions and expressed them quietly. Women who helped each other, educated each other, supported each other through the oppressive systems they lived under. Women who survived and resisted in ways that history did not record but that mattered enormously. The Georgian reputation system was designed to control women completely, to monitor their bodies, their movements, their words, their thoughts, to keep them afraid, dependent, obedient. And it worked, for many women. The fear was real, the consequences were real, the suffering was real. But the system did not break every woman. It did not silence every voice. It did not prevent every act of courage. And slowly, through the cumulative effect of thousands of small rebellions and a few large ones, the system began to crack. The Victorian era that followed was in some ways even more restrictive, but it also saw the first organised women's rights movements, women fighting for education, for property rights, for the vote, and those women were building on the foundation laid by Georgian rebels like Mary Wollstonecraft. The 20th century brought more change. Women got the vote, they got access to education, they got legal rights they had never had before. And the 21st century has brought even more progress, though we still have far to go. But the fundamental questions remain. How much of ourselves do we sacrifice for acceptance? How do we navigate systems designed to limit us? How do we maintain authenticity in a world that rewards performance? How do we support each other in fighting for freedom? Georgian women faced these questions with fewer resources, fewer rights, fewer options than we have now, and still, some of them found ways to live freely, to choose courageously, to refuse compromise. If they could do it then, in that restrictive, surveillance-heavy, consequence-laden world, surely we can do it now. So here is what I hope you take from this journey through Georgian fears and absurdities. Yes, the rules were ridiculous. Yes, the double standards were infuriating. Yes, the system was designed to control and diminish women. All of that is true. But it is also true that women resisted. Women survived. Women found joy and meaning and connection despite everything designed to prevent it. Women helped each other, taught each other, loved each other through the darkness. And women changed the world, slowly but surely, through courage and creativity and sheer stubborn refusal to accept what they were told was inevitable. The Georgian women who managed their dance cards and watched their ankles and hid their pregnancies and performed their accomplishments, they were not weak. They were incredibly strong. They navigated impossible systems with grace and intelligence. They found ways to be human in a world that wanted them to be ornaments. And the Georgian women who rebelled, who chose freedom over reputation, who lived boldly despite the costs. They were not reckless. They were visionary. They imagined a different world and lived as if it already existed, paving the way for those who would come after. So the next time you feel trapped by expectations, monitored by judgments, afraid of consequences, remember the Georgian women. Remember that the systems designed to control us are not inevitable. They are human constructions, and what humans build, humans can change. Remember that courage is possible, that rebellion is necessary, that freedom is worth fighting for, and remember that you are not alone. Just as Georgian women helped each other through whispered conversations and passed down knowledge and quiet acts of solidarity, we can help each other. We can share our truths, support each other's choices, create spaces where authenticity is celebrated rather than punished. The Georgian era is over. Those specific rules, those particular fears, they belong to history. But the spirit of the women who navigated and resisted that system, that spirit is timeless. It lives in everyone who chooses truth over performance, in everyone who refuses to be diminished, in everyone who believes that people deserve to live freely, fully, authentically. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these stories of absurdity and courage, of oppression and resistance, of fear and freedom. I hope they have brought you some comfort, some humor, some inspiration. I hope they have reminded you that systems of control are not inevitable, that progress is possible, that human courage and creativity can overcome even the most oppressive circumstances. If you have enjoyed this strange exploration of Georgian reputation fears, if these stories have resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me which part surprised you most, which woman's story inspired you, what parallels you see between Georgian fears and modern anxieties. Your thoughts matter. Your voice matters. And please, if this video brought you something valuable, share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring history's fascinating, infuriating, inspiring stories together. Because history is not just about the past. It is about understanding ourselves, understanding where we come from, understanding how we can build better futures. Sleep well, friends. Dream of women in empire waist gowns climbing onto ships bound for distant deserts. Dream of women publishing revolutionary books under assumed names. Dream of women choosing each other, choosing themselves, choosing freedom. Dream of courage, and when you wake, I will be here again, ready to share another story, another journey through time. Until then, may your rest be peaceful, and may your dreams be bold. Good night.